and the chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. Welcome to today's hearing, Scaling for Growth, meeting the demand on reliable, affordable electricity. Today we will discuss the state of our nation's bulk power system and the opportunities that lie ahead in the next generation economy. Our economy's electric grid, built over the course of well over 100 plus years, has been referred to as the most complex, sophisticated machine known to mankind. When operating correctly, the U.S. grid efficiently delivers low-cost, reliable energy to communities of all sizes. Through extensive planning, coordination, and collaboration from a host of government and industry partners, this complex process seamlessly responds in real time to maintain reliability in both normal and extreme weather conditions. Yet today, historic increases in electricity demand, primarily from energy-intensive AI models and domestic manufacturing, are exposing key impediments to the ability of utilities, grid operators, and generators to keep the lights on. When the lights go out, people's lives are at stake. The entities charged with overseeing our electric grid have been warning of potential shortfalls under normal weather conditions. Extreme weather or unforeseen circumstances could turn catastrophic. In 2025, the Energy Information Administration projects 12.3 gigawatts of coal capacities are set to retire. By the end of the decade, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation projects as high as 52 gigawatts of thermal generation will retire. The stakes could not be higher. Across the world, our adversaries are seeking to undermine U.S. leadership on the world stage to write the rules on the next generation economy. Nations like Communist China, who do not share our democratic values, are seeking to develop world-leading AI models through an authoritarian military lens to export their command and control style of governance across the world. Yet within this emerging crisis, there's an opportunity of our nation to correct course and grow jobs, creating industries right here at home. But to get there, we need more energy, and we need it fast. The Department of Energy's Berkeley lab estimates that U.S. data center growth alone is projected to double or triple by 2028. I know in my district, it's home to over 86,000 manufacturing jobs. I'm keenly aware of this problem. And I always say that we're not just operating with needing electricity and power in my district, we need affordable power to make sure. The Clean Power Plan 2.0 is driving accelerated premature retirements of our baseload power. Permitting barriers for new natural gas pipeline infrastructure are handicapping regions of the country, such as the Northeast, that are desperate for energy. Meanwhile, subsidized intermittent energy resources and public policy decisions to favor renewable energy are flooding interconnection queues and making baseload power from coal, natural gas, and nuclear near uneconomic. Generation developers continue experiencing ongoing supply chain constraints for distribution transformers and generation turbines. As we will hear today, House Republicans are not alone in raising the alarm. Today's discussion will help illuminate the ways in which grid operators, utilities, and co-ops are all addressing these challenging dynamics to protect reliability and affordability while providing the opportunity to grow jobs, creating industries. The witnesses for us today will provide a holistic approach of the nation's electricity system, the unique characteristics of each respective region of the country, and the challenges facing grid governing regimes. PJM, the nation's largest regional transmission organization, which spans 13 states in Washington, D.C., organizes competitive wholesale markets to buy, sell electricity, and monitors reliability standards across their multi-state footprint. In the West Basin Electric Co-op, members serve 3 million consumers across 9 states, spanning both vertically integrated states and organized markets. Southern Company, a traditional vertically integrated utility, reliably serves customers across the Southeast with a diverse portfolio of generating resources. So I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have today with each of the respective entity and region and how they're confronting this new frontier in the demand expansion. And this subcommittee will play an integral role in laying the groundwork to unlock the necessary capital investment for job-creating industries while ensuring affordable and reliable energy for American households and small businesses. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time with 3 seconds. At this time, I recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentle lady from Florida, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. Mr. Chairman, we've just received some very sad news, the passing of one of our colleagues, Congressman Sylvester Turner from Houston. And if Representative Fletcher were here, she would say Houston is the energy innovation capital of the world. Sylvester Turner was the longtime mayor of Houston. He was just elected. He was with us yesterday, had brought his guests to the Capitol. So would you indulge us for a moment of silence in his memory?
The subcommittee will pause for a moment of silence.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yield to the gentleman.
Thank you. I thank the gentlelady. I served with Sylvester Turner 4 years in the Texas House. I hated him because when he went to the back mic and talked against my bill, he made me look like a fool, which is not hard to do. Y'all all know that, right? Great champion for Texas, great champion for Houston, such a gentleman, such a scholar. I saw him last night, coming off the floor in his wheelchair. I was shocked this morning. So he will be missed. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Weber.
Thank you. I too served with Sylvester, and I'm a little shook. He was a legend, and he was one of the most decent men you ever met. And Randy's correct. If you were at the front mic and he was at the back mic, you're dead. He was one of the smartest men you've ever met, one of the nicest. My father has a wall of fame on it at the house. He's got a photo with him and Ronald Reagan, him and Lady Thatcher, him and George W. Bush, and Sylvester Turner. That's how much he meant to people. It wasn't about party, it was about the person, and it was about Texas. And that's who Sylvester Turner was, and he'll be greatly missed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you. The gentlelady is recognized.
Well, thank you. I want to thank our colleagues for sharing their sentiments about Congressman Turner. Meanwhile, back here in the Energy Subcommittee, it is difficult to dive into this very important topic. Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate you focusing in on that, but at the same time, it's rather absurd that we're tackling strengthening our electrical system while Elon Musk and the Trump administration are taking a sledgehammer to the Department of Energy, and especially the initiatives that strengthen and modernize the grid. The new administration has spent weeks illegally shutting down DOE grants and loans and partnerships that make energy safe, reliable, and affordable. And that includes the illegal firings of the Department of Energy Inspector General, who is tasked with rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse, and firing the scientists who protect our nuclear enterprise. Meanwhile, the administration and House Republicans have offered nothing to help hardworking Americans tackle the cost of living, including their electric bills. In fact, consumers are losing confidence as Republicans focus on tax breaks for the wealthy and the well-connected and handouts to big oil and gas. And beware, Canada and Mexico are major manufacturers of electrical grid components like transformers and circuit breakers and switch gears, which are needed to update our growing grid. And Trump's tariffs will make these upgrades more expensive, and they'll take even longer, not to mention the direct cost increases that tariffs have on electricity, especially on the northern states. As part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Department of Energy was administering a large grid resilience and innovation partnership initiative. The intent there was to enhance grid flexibility and improve the resilience of the power system against extreme events like hurricanes in my neck of the woods. One GRIP project was a battery installation at an Iron Mountain data center in Virginia that was meant to test the potential to store clean backup power and grid support uses. On his first day in office, though, the president illegally froze that project, as well as $103 million in grid funding that should be helping my neighbors back home in Florida. Growing America's leadership in artificial intelligence requires access to more energy. We'll see a doubling in data center electricity capacity by 2030 from projects already under construction. A 1 gigawatt data center would be the single largest energy load in the United States today, and we're building dozens of them. And to support data centers and broader electricity growth, the U.S. Energy Information Association forecasts that the U.S. will build 63 gigawatts of new utility-scale capacity this year. 94% of that is zero carbon. And gas will not magically solve this challenge, even for those who decide they want to build a new gas plant. If they make that decision today, the plant won't come online before 2030. Next generation technologies like advanced geothermal and nuclear, while incredibly promising, are at least several years away. And here's a fact check of the speech last night. The president misleadingly said the Biden administration had closed more than 100 power plants. That's not true. According to the Department of Energy, the total number of electric power plants increased by 2,187 from 2020 to 2023. That is, the number of utility-scale electric power plants in the nation actually increased during the Biden administration. There were about 11,000 in 2020, compared with about 13,250 in 2023. Solar, wind, and batteries are the least expensive, cleanest, and fastest way to add energy to the grid right now. They're driving down energy costs now. And if we want to lower the cost of energy and we want more reliable energy, then we should be making it easier to build solar, wind, and batteries whenever it makes sense to do so. That's why it's raising huge red flags that the Trump administration is unceremoniously halting these grid and power projects. And if Republicans were willing to stand up for the innovative work to modernize the grid that is happening right now, then there are real policies that we could work on together. The real barriers to getting new power online for data centers, for large-scale manufacturing, or just everyday American families is the limited capacity and disjointedness of our power grid. We need to build more transmission to enable more generation and get more out of our existing grid infrastructure. The U.S. has two options. We can choose to double down on outdated fossil fuel strategies that are more expensive, slower to interconnect, and are big polluters, or we can choose the other option, advancing real policies that deliver cheaper, cleaner, faster power that could benefit everyone. I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, the chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time, and thank you for all the witnesses for being here. Gosh, I just met Mr. Turner, Representative Turner, I think yesterday, the day before, sitting in the center aisle, just chatted with him and introduced myself. And for what I've heard from people spoken today, I really miss a lot, by only knowing him for less than a day. And my thoughts and prayers are with his family and all of us here in Congress when we lose a colleague. It's tough. So God bless his family. But turning to today's hearing, it's going to continue our important work in this committee to identify what is necessary to unleash American energy for the benefit of the public, the economy, and our national security. Without question, energy, and especially the affordable, reliable delivery of electric power, is essential for America to make and do the things needed for a secure and strong economy. Affordable, reliable power is essential for growing manufacturing, for advancing the great promises of AI, and for producing the goods and services our constituents rely upon. It is essential for health and safety. To ensure we have the right federal policies, we must examine how the key players in our power sector, the utilities, grid operators, state and federal regulators, are preparing for a future of extraordinary electricity growth. The witnesses today who have worked to provide power will help us in this examination. A pair of tough challenges make our task particularly urgent. The first challenge concerns the factors behind the emerging reliability crisis. In recent years, we have witnessed the failure to ensure that there is power when our communities need it the most. This crisis has been caused by the loss of huge amounts of reliable, baseload, and dispatchable generation across many regions of our nation following the misguided regulations and without adequate replacement for those resources. The resulting threats of blackouts and brownouts, even in normal peak demand conditions, have been extending across the most populous regions of the nation, as authorities like the North American Electric Reliability Corporation show. Federal and state policies have driven growth of intermittent or weather-dependent wind and solar generation at the expense of generation we will need for a reliable system. It's all important. This has increased the risk for tens of millions of Americans. Many of our constituents have already experienced costly and deadly power outages. This started in California when we witnessed it in Texas 3 years ago during Winter Storm Uri. Just 2 years ago, Southeast and East Coast communities, including Kentucky, lost power. We had rolling blackouts in Kentucky, a TVA area, due to the lack of supply power during the winter event. The root cause of this situation is the lack of reliable generation capacity constraints on natural gas supplies. The second challenge involves the new energy demand of AI and cutting-edge technologies. The need for power to expand and advance AI in America is coming with a blinding fast urgency that represents a generational challenge in the need for more reliable electricity. This presents its own unique challenges layered upon the existing problems and threats. This hearing will help us understand what is being done by the power sector utilities and operators to meet these challenges and respond to the urgency of exploding demand. I thank you, Chair Latta, for having this hearing. I welcome the witnesses, and I will yield to the gentlelady from North Dakota, Ms. Fedorchak, with the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this opportunity. I would have been honored to introduce 3 out of the 4 panelists because I've worked closely with all of them, but I'm going to take a minute to introduce a fellow North Dakotan. I'm honored to introduce Mr. Todd Brickhouse, who embodies the values of hard work, innovation, and community service. As the CEO and General Manager of Basin Electric Power Cooperative, Todd leads one of our state's largest and most prominent businesses. It's an organization that delivers reliable, affordable power to millions of people throughout the Great Plains. With over 25 years of experience, Todd has dedicated his career to ensuring that rural America and America as a whole has the energy it needs to grow and thrive. Like most in this industry, Todd's work isn't about politics. It's about problem solving. That's what I appreciate most about working with folks in this industry. It's about powering everything from farms and small businesses to emerging industries like carbon capture and data centers. Todd's leadership is doing just that, as are others on this panel. Today, Todd brings Dakota common sense to DC, and I'm proud to welcome him and his amazing team who are behind him before our committee today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and the chairman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for question, or for, pardon me, 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Latta. This hearing is an important and timely topic. Unfortunately, it's happening in the midst of chaos and confusion for the energy industry because of the actions of President Trump and congressional Republicans. Grid operators around the country are begging Congress to take the challenges they're facing seriously, and instead Republicans just passed a budget that would gut programs and incentives vital to electric reliability while simultaneously cutting Medicaid to fund tax breaks for billionaires. And President Trump's Department of Energy continues to freeze and slow walk billions of dollars in investments in the clean energy sector, which could result in higher energy costs on American families. It's all unacceptable, in my opinion. And it's frustrating because this subcommittee has important policy decisions to consider. After a 20-year pause, demand for power in the United States is growing again. And as I've repeatedly said, this is an opportunity. It means that companies are investing in America, that cutting-edge technologies are being developed here, and that families are making investments in decarbonizing their homes and vehicles. These are good things if the power sector can meet the challenge. We need to act to make sure that our grid remains reliable and affordable over the next decade. That means removing unnecessary barriers to clean energy and making sure that we're adequately planning for a 21st century grid. Claims that this challenge can only be met with an endless fleet of natural gas power plants are completely misguided. For one, the gas turbine supply chain simply won't allow it. Gas turbine manufacturers are backed up and cannot fulfill new orders until 2029. But more importantly, we need a solution that won't saddle homeowners and businesses with higher energy bills to pay for assets that may not be used for 20 years. And we need to find a way to ensure that new large loads like data centers powering AI are paying for their fair share of grid infrastructure, regardless of whether they're co-located with generation sources or pulling electricity directly from the grid itself. And these aren't speculative issues for the future. They're happening now. Families in my home state of New Jersey are going to experience a nearly 25% increase in their power costs this June, in part because PJM seems incapable of getting its act together to quickly add renewable resources to its grid. The Texas grid operator, which serves less power demand than PJM, managed to add 11 gigawatts of generation and storage capacity last year. And PJM only managed to add less than half of that, despite having a whopping 143 gigawatts in its queue. We should be working together to develop solutions to address this problem, but unfortunately, the Trump administration and Republicans have other ideas. The Bonneville Power Administration, which is absolutely vital for electric reliability in the Pacific Northwest, was forced to fire 20% of its workforce as part of Elon Musk's dismantling of the federal workforce, despite the fact that it doesn't cost taxpayers a dime. Republicans are also taking aim at independent regulators, vital for reliability and affordability, like FERC and the NRC. And because the Trump administration cut corners in its definition of energy in its executive orders, there's a lot of confusion about whether the tariff on electricity imports from Canada is 0, 10, or 25%. It's a complete disaster, and it's going to likely lead to higher energy costs for American consumers, particularly in the Northeast. Now, Trump and Republicans are trying to gut and repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and these laws are critical to ensuring that new energy sources get built and that existing ones, especially nuclear plants, stay online. 2 new studies, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to insert them into the record. I'll hand them over to you here.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. They show that repealing the Inflation Reduction Act's technology-neutral tax credits would increase prices on families and decrease the amount of power brought onto the grid. The reality is that clean energy is the only source of new generation capable of meeting growing power demand at scale. Clean energy sources and battery storage are 95% of the interconnection queue, and they're not going away. In fact, they're the only thing that can come to the rescue and power our manufacturing and AI renaissance. And gutting the Inflation Reduction Act and illegally freezing funds will only ensure that our grid won't be able to keep up with demand, all while radically increasing energy prices for our constituents. So I can say, Mr. Chairman, Democrats are going to fight against Republicans' radical agenda that makes our electricity less reliable, more expensive, and dirtier. So thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time, and that now concludes our member opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. At this time, we want to also thank our witnesses again for being here with us today and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. Each witness will have an opportunity to give an opening statement, followed by a round of questions from the members. Our witnesses today are Mr. Todd Brickhouse, the Chief Executive Officer and General Manager of Basin Electric Power Cooperative. Mr. Asim Haque, Senior Vice President for Governmental and Member Services at PJM. Mr. Tyler Norris, the James B. Duke Fellow at Duke University, and Mr. Noel Black, Senior Vice President at Regulatory Affairs at the Southern Company. And before we get started, just a quick housekeeping. If you want to make sure you pull the mic up close to you when you speak. And there's the set of red lights there, that will signal you have a green light for 4 minutes. It will go yellow with 1 minute remaining, and at red, that means stop. So we appreciate you following that. And with that, Mr. Haque, Mr. Brickhouse, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you indicated, my name is Todd Brickhouse, and I'm the CEO of Basin Electric Power Cooperative. Basin is a not-for-profit generation and transmission cooperative, and we are owned by 139 member cooperatives across 9 states, and we serve 3 million consumers. As measured by our geographic retail service territory, Basin is the largest electric utility in the country. We serve roughly 500,000 square miles, which is 12% of the United States. So we like to say that Basin's assets are the engines of commerce for a service territory that feeds and fuels our nation. Basin is one of nearly 900 not-for-profit electric cooperatives across the country that are independently owned and governed by the people that we serve. Electric cooperatives provide electric service to 42 million Americans in 48 states. There are a number of trends and policies impacting our country and electric utilities, and I'd like to touch on a few of those this morning. Reshoring our manufacturing base, guaranteeing our energy security, and supporting the development of artificial intelligence all significantly increase demand for electric power. After all, the electrons that many of us on this panel provide are the raw materials of a modern economy. To satisfy this growing demand, Basin is currently increasing its generation portfolio by more than 40%, and we are increasing our transmission mileage by more than 20%. Over the next decade, we will spend $12 billion on these endeavors. That compares to currently $8.5 billion of assets on our balance sheet today. Federal regulations should be streamlined to support our efforts. For example, our recent Roundup Tacoma Ridge transmission project required 2 separate environmental assessments, one from the Bureau of Land Management and another from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, even though both these agencies are under the Department of the Interior. This resulted in added time, expense, and of course, red tape. Secondly, Basin is currently adding 1,500 megawatts of non-dispatchable renewable resources to our generation fleet. This has required years of planning and development work, and these business decisions were made based on the availability of production tax credits. We understand and we support the need to put our country on a sustainable fiscal path, but the immediate removal of PTCs will not allow utilities to plan for and avoid increased costs, and this will also immediately harm ratepayers. Another policy matter that needs to be on your mind is tariffs, which the President spoke about last night. We strive to source our capital expenditure program domestically, but the utility industry relies on global supply chain. Our $12 billion capital expenditure program will be adversely impacted by tariffs. And I'd just like to explain to you that these are not one-time costs. These are costs that will be felt over 30 years as we depreciate these assets and we repay the debt used to fund them. Finally, and most importantly, in order to capitalize on the opportunities of reshoring our manufacturing base, guaranteeing our energy security, and fully developing artificial intelligence, we need consistent and rational energy policies from you all. Every sector of our economy depends on reliable and affordable electricity, whether it be households, manufacturers, or the technology industry. As Daniel Yergin and Peter Orzog wrote in an article last week, we are not, and I quote, "We are not so much in an energy transition, we are in an energy addition." Periodic efforts to severely curtail major sources of dispatchable electric generation are counterproductive, and they do not further our national interest. Microsoft and Amazon recognize the importance of dispatchable resources as evidenced by their recent partnership with the nuclear industry. Similarly, Meta or Facebook has recently partnered with Entergy for the development of 2,300 megawatts of dispatchable natural gas resources in Louisiana. Basin is in discussions with more than 7,000 megawatts of similar loads. The Great Plains, where Basin serves, offers abundant wind and carbon-based natural resources, helping Basin satisfy growing demand in a balanced manner. Basin stands ready to support efforts by Congress, the administration, and federal agencies to enhance affordability and reliability for the American consumer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Haque, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Chairman Latta, Ranking Member Castor, Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to participate in this hearing to provide PJM's perspective as it relates to electric grid reliability and cost during this period of heavy forecasted demand growth. My name is Asim Haque, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Governmental and Member Services at PJM Interconnection. PJM is considered the largest grid operator in North America as we ensure the reliable flow of power to 67 million consumers in all or parts of 13 states and the District of Columbia. PJM is an entity without profit motive. We effectively function as a not-for-profit that is fully regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, an independent federal agency that plays a critical role in the oversight of the energy industry. We are a mission-driven organization whose primary focus is to keep the lights on for the 67 million consumers that we serve. This past January, during a cold spell, we experienced our all-time winter peak of approximately 145,000 megawatts. And if you were here in the district or otherwise in our footprint during MLK weekend, you probably didn't think for a second about the cold weather and its impact on the grid, and that's how we like it. And that's the expectation that we create for ourselves at PJM, which is, in tandem with our asset owners, to keep the lights on 24/7 without you having to think about it. While our industry can be quite complicated, what we're seeing projecting out into the future actually is not incredibly complicated. After years of what has been relatively flat demand for power in PJM, we are now seeing a major uptick in forecasted growth due primarily to the proliferation of data centers, but also due to electrification and the onshoring of U.S. manufacturing. According to our most recent forecast, PJM expects its summer peak to climb to 220,000 megawatts over the next 15 years. To compare, our all-time summer peak, which occurred in 2006, is 165,563 megawatts. For winter, the forecast is estimated at 210,000 megawatts, again, 15 years out. PJM's record high winter peak, again, occurred just this past January at 145,000 megawatts. So we are experiencing in real time, as well as forecasting out, the substantial increase in demand. So let's talk about supply. After years of having a healthy reserve margin in PJM, we are seeing that reserve margin get eaten up. PJM conducted a study in 2023 where we estimated retirements in the amount of 40,000 megawatts by 2030, driven primarily by state and federal policies and some economics. Now, we do have a number of mostly renewable resources that want to connect to the system that are currently in our generation interconnection queue. That queue has undergone quite a bit of reform per our own efforts and an order from the FERC in 2022, and we are nearing the end of that FERC-approved reform. We hope that all of these projects interconnect, but we certainly have quite a few projects that are through the queue right now that aren't constructing at the pace needed to keep up with supply retirements and certainly not the projected increase in demand. Last year, we interconnected just 4,800 megawatts into an otherwise 180,000 megawatt system. So supply is coming off of the system, and new supply additions are not keeping pace. Again, currently about 50,000 megawatts through the queue, nothing left to do with PJM and not interconnecting or not constructing, and we can talk about that a little more. We should also note that the resources leaving the system are larger dispatchable coal and gas resources, and the resources that we are adding from our queue are primarily intermittent renewable resources. We are resource agnostic, and when you flip the switch, you don't know whether that's a nuclear, coal, gas, renewable watt that you've just consumed. But when you trace those watts all the way back to their source, all of these resource types have different capability and availability. So we need to be conscious of that. It's not a one-for-one swap in terms of availability and capability of the resources that we're retiring and then the resources that we're adding to the system. But either way, we want those watts. We want those renewable resources to find their way onto the system as soon as possible. We want as much supply as we can get in order to meet this growing demand. That means delaying retirements, new supply, that's supply in our queue, and even additional supply on top of that. So again, supply is decreasing, demand is increasing, but for your constituents, the supply-demand imbalance has the potential to bleed into fundamental pillars of power delivery for the average American, which are really reliability and cost. We all need to consider reliability degradation and consumer cost increases as a natural byproduct of policies that exacerbate this supply-demand imbalance. I want to end my opening statement with some optimism. The fact that we're here talking about supply and demand is great progress. We've been talking about this, PJM, for some years now, and the fact that this committee is focused on the supply-demand challenge is a really good thing. The fact that demand is growing means that our nation's economy is growing, and that's a really good thing as well. We have lots of resources that want to interconnect in the PJM system. That's a really good thing as well. PJM in particular has markets that it can utilize to incentivize our next major technological breakthrough, as well as any new resources that we can possibly find onto the system.
Pardon
So
me,
again,
if you could just finish up, please.
Yep.
Thank you.
So again, this is a moment here at PJM. It's a moment for the industry, and in conjunction with our stakeholders and with all of you, we expect to meet that moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Norris, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Latta, Ranking Member Castor, Chairman Guthrie, and Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm informed that another Tyler testified a month ago. I assure you this is not coordinated. My name is Tyler Norris. I'm a James B. Duke Fellow at Duke University, where my PhD research focuses on electric power systems. My research is informed by 15 years of experience in the energy sector, spanning utility-scale power plant development, electricity market forecasting, and technology commercialization at the Department of Energy. I'm here today in my personal capacity. My testimony draws in part from my research as lead author of a new study called Rethinking Load Growth, released last month by Duke University's Nicholas Institute. While demand presents challenges, our research suggests that with strategic planning, the U.S. power system is well positioned to integrate these loads in a reliable and cost-effective manner. My testimony focuses on 3 areas. First, how the existing power system can integrate new large loads while preserving reliability. Second, how interconnection reforms can accelerate new generation. Third, how these near-term solutions can buy time and capital for long lead resources like bulk transmission and nuclear power. First, our analysis finds that with modest flexibility from new large loads, the grid can accommodate significant demand growth without major new infrastructure. The U.S. power system is already designed to handle extreme peaks in demand, meaning that in most hours, a substantial portion of the power system is unutilized. And in fact, we found that the average utilization rate of the U.S. power system is 53%, meaning that nearly half of our power infrastructure sits unused at any given time. If new large loads, such as AI data centers, can adjust their power consumption during a small fraction of high-stress hours on the order of 0.5% of their maximum uptime, the grid could absorb the equivalent of 4 or 5 Project Stargates, the $500 billion data center initiative announced by President Trump. This highlights a key opportunity. Leveraging existing capacity through flexible load strategies can provide a bridge while long lead resources such as new transmission and clean firm generation are developed. Second, while load flexibility can help, interconnection delays remain a major obstacle to deploying new generation, and the volume of projects stuck in interconnection queues has quadrupled to 2,600 gigawatts. However, there's one market, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. They've taken a different approach, and it's achieving significantly greater interconnection performance than other U.S. markets. Between 2021 to 2023, ERCOT interconnected at least 70% more generation capacity than any other organized market, despite serving a load that is half the size of PJM's. Unlike other regions, which require extensive studies and costly network upgrades before allowing new generators to connect, ERCOT permits interconnection first and manages grid impacts in real time while planning transmission upgrades separately. While not all markets can replicate ERCOT's approach without structural reforms, there are meaningful steps that FERC and other policymakers can take to improve interconnection efficiency. These include adopting a less restrictive approach to energy resource interconnection service, enabling generators to use grid capacity reserved for existing power plants, and developing interconnection entry fees to provide greater upfront certainty. Finally, long-term reliability will require investment in new transmission and clean firm generation. These resources can take a decade to develop, and their high capital costs makes them highly sensitive to policy uncertainty. So stable federal policies, including maintaining tax incentives, loan guarantees, and clear transmission planning processes will be critical to ensuring that these projects are built. At the same time, a hasty overbuild of new gas infrastructure in response to load growth could undermine private investment in clean firm technologies such as advanced nuclear and geothermal. If investors perceive that policymakers are tilting the playing field towards gas or creating excess capacity that substantially depresses capacity prices, they may be reluctant to commit to these higher risk long-term investments. In conclusion, by leveraging flexible load, streamlining interconnection, and investing in long lead resources, the U.S. can maintain reliability while enabling economic growth and making progress on decarbonization. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much for your opening statement. Mr. Black, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Latta, Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss what we see as an exciting but pressing policy issues around electricity. Electricity is the lifeblood of our modern society. It's an essential service woven into every aspect of our lives. It powers our homes and hospitals, drives our economic growth, and ensures the well-being and safety of our customers. We believe this interconnected grid that we have built over the last 100 years is irreplaceable in delivering electric service and provides scale and value that other solutions can't match. Electricity is a necessity, and access to reliable electricity is a fundamental expectation. When electricity is unstable or unaffordable, the real-world impacts are immediate and can be severe. Our responsibility is to ensure the grid delivers dependable, cost-effective energy no matter the circumstances and over the long term. At Southern Company, our 28,000 employees take this very seriously. Every day we work to serve 9 million customers who rely on us. Our diverse 44,000 megawatt interconnected fleet spanning nuclear and hydro, natural gas, coal, and renewables demonstrates how an intentionally engineered approach provides a foundation for energy security. Our system, this interconnected grid, is a modern engineering marvel, as we've heard earlier. Utilities like ours are an essential piece of the energy equation. It's not only the interconnected grid it is only, beg your pardon, the interconnected grid with its scope and scale that can meet all customers' needs. Southern Company's commitment to innovation and resilience is evident. With the recent addition of new nuclear units at Vogtle, we now operate the largest nuclear generation station in the country. In this moment of rapid energy growth, it's become obvious how electricity and energy, though, are highly regional in nature. The weather, resources, state and local politics, geography, the region's load profile, and market structure greatly impact the physics and finance of delivering electricity. We have all heard the one-size-fits-all approach are often not appropriate for energy policy. That's because of this intense regionalism that drives energy outcomes. At Southern Company, our customers are the beneficiaries of a state-regulated, vertically integrated market structure that holds us, Southern Company, directly accountable. Straightforward regulatory models like ours, where the accountability for the grid is clearly understood, are producing results enabling this innovation economy. In short, the Southeast remains open for business. Regions with unusually complex regulatory processes are experiencing slower infrastructure build-out. I think this may be why the concept of co-location has become so popular in certain parts of the country. Time-challenged customers see co-location as a tool to cut through some of the complexities. As those regions consider co-location arrangements, however, it will be critical to ensure that existing everyday customers are protected. Co-location arrangements we don't see are not necessary in our region because we are timely serving this demand. At Southern Company, we have a robust, well-planned energy system that seeks to protect all customers from price volatility. Under the watchful eyes of our regulators, we strive to make the right investments today to keep prices stable and support economic expansion, which helps mitigate any inflationary pressures tomorrow. However, and I'm about to wrap up, and this is important, to sustain this momentum, we must continue to invest in infrastructure. The reality is clear. Infrastructure, particularly natural gas infrastructure, is required now to meet the rising demand. Pipelines, transmission systems, and generation capacity must keep pace with the economy. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I look forward to discussing how we can work together to ensure America continues to benefit from abundant, reliable, and affordable energy.
Well, thank you very much for your opening statement, and that will conclude our opening statements from our witnesses. We will now begin the questions from our members, and I'll begin the questions and recognize myself for 5 minutes. One of the questions I asked everybody who came before us in subcommittee in the last conference was very simple. I just get a yes or no. Do we need more energy production in this country or less? Mr. Brickhouse?
Yes.
Mr. Haque?
Yes.
Mr. Norris? Mr. Black?
Absolutely.
Thank you. That's exactly the same response I got from everybody in the last Congress. Boy, so lots of questions and so little time that we get. But if I could start, Mr. Haque, if I could ask you some quick questions. We had the polar vortex that went across the Midwest in 2014. And I know in talking with PJM, I think every year I ask the same questions. If we could sustain what we were able to do, not having blackouts, brownouts at that time. But when looking at PJM's statements and also what was told in my office, that we also now we're looking at 2026. What could happen in 2026 if we had another massive polar vortex?
So, Chairman, where we're headed is this continued supply-demand crunch. So again, supply is coming off the system. We're not seeing a lot of new supply added to the system. And then we're seeing these major upticks in demand.
Let me interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me ask you what you just said, because also in your testimony you brought this up. We're taking off generation at the same time the demand is going up. Should we be looking at not taking off that generation, and why is that generation being taken offline?
The drivers behind generation leaving the system are primarily state and federal decarbonization policies. In tandem with some economics. We put out a study in 2023, it was an energy transition study that we put together that expressed the statistics around the drivers for supply leaving the system.
Well, that's concerning because, if we're taking it off at the same time, we're having more need. It's going to be a real problem for us. Mr. Black, if I could ask, in your statement and also toward your closing of your statement, you're talking about that we need to be investing in that infrastructure that supports rapid growth. Was the whole idea and the whole notion of all these data centers coming online ever projected maybe 10 years ago from what we were looking at in our generation that we had to have?
Definitely not projected, but definitely manageable, right? So I think we go through processes called IRPs, or integrated resource planning processes, every few years, and we expedited one in Georgia recently so that we can, it's back to that notion of intentionally designing and engineering our system and fleet to meet this moment. I would say we think about it and manage it really through this notion of energy abundance as well, right? Supply and demand obviously is an issue in everything thing we deal with in our lives, but I think we seek to make sure we are available, and that availability and abundance puts downward pressure on rates for us, right? And I think that's really important issue, and obviously in this moment of meeting this demand, we can do both.
Thank you. Mr. Brickhouse, I have probably more electric co-ops in my district than any other district in the state of Ohio. And I know the importance what you all do out there. But, you know, a couple of the questions I think it's very important that you brought up was about addressing permitting. And on the permitting side, if we don't do something, what's going to happen out there if we don't address permitting? Especially for not just you, but for anybody that's out there either generating or on the transmission of power.
All right, well, what my colleague from PJM referenced was a large uptick in or mismatch between supply and demand. And I think that mismatch is critical for policymakers to understand. It takes us 7 years from initial concept to bringing on and actually generating electrons for a power plant. You can bring on a data center in 3 years. So what we're faced with now is having to tell data centers and other large loads that they need to wait up to 7 years in order to build their facilities. So permitting is a key part of it, and we need more sensible permitting action coming out of Congress and, frankly, in some of the states we serve as well.
Well, I appreciate everyone being here today because all the things that we've heard from our witnesses, this is what we have to be addressing to make sure we meet our power needs into the future. And my time has expired, and I now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Norris, your new study caught my attention because you say that we can accommodate some of the additional capacity we need through flexible load strategies. What are you talking about here?
Thank you, Ranking Member. What flexible load strategies refer to is for a very, very small number of hours a year where the system is experiencing its highest stress, that these large electricity consumers could reduce their consumption from the grid from a variety of possible avenues. One would be if they have their own on-site power or battery storage that they could tap. Again, we're talking on an average basis of 2 hours per event. That's one option. A lot of the new AI data centers have the ability to defer their workloads. These are the training workloads to train the foundational models, and so those are deferrable. Other advanced data center companies have now found the ability to shift those workloads to other data centers in other regions during extreme weather events. And then finally, there is the option to simply temporarily reduce operations. And this is the case for other computational loads like Bitcoin mining. And those are actually some of the most flexible loads on the system that we see right now. And they're able to dispatch down almost instantaneously in response to signals from the grid.
Will this help us address the growing concern with additional costs to consumers, to other ratepayers as AI data centers demand more energy?
Yes, there's an opportunity here because we already have a relatively low utilization rate for the existing power system. So if new loads utilize the existing system more, that can result in actual reduction in rates to the existing ratepayers. So that's a great opportunity. The challenge becomes when the new loads end up triggering the need for substantial new grid infrastructure and new power plants that are only needed to serve a limited number of hours in the year for peaking capacity. And so I think it's important to consider guardrails when you're talking about potential significant increase in rates in response to that capacity expansion.
So is that a job for Congress? Is that a job for FERC? Is that a job for public utility commissions? Or all of the above?
I think it's probably all of the above. I mean, one of the challenges that we face right now is that in large load interconnection, there are no standardized processes. So this is state jurisdictional as retail rates usually are. But it's very different from generator interconnection where we have very standardized processes. It's FERC regulated. So it's really the Wild West right now, and each state is kind of doing it differently. And so I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to opine on sort of the jurisdictional issues between FERC and states. But I think other former FERC commissioners are saying right now as we speak that it would be helpful to have some degree of standardization.
So Mr. Haque, what do you think of this? And have you looked at this study?
I have looked at the study. I think there's a lot there with respect to demand flexibility, and we have actually been in conversations with data centers who are trying to locate into the footprint about their ability to be flexible. It is not clear whether or not these data centers can actually express the kind of flexibility that is described in Mr. Norris's paper. And so, I agree. I agree with Mr. Norris that if we are able to get some flexibility from data center load, that we may not have to plan necessarily for, because we plan our systems based on peak, because we want to serve 24/7, 365.
And I hear you loud and clear about the interconnection queue problem. And that clearly is an area where Congress could help get these large power sources onto the grid. Do you agree?
Representative, our generation interconnection queue has been reformed. So we got an order from the FERC in 2022, and we are at the tail end of implementing that reform. It has taken some time to get the queue from a position where it was evaluating these large centralized generating stations, now evaluating many hundreds, if not more, of smaller renewable projects. So we realize that the queue's been a
you're
challenge.
ahead of the game compared to others?
I have not benchmarked us necessarily against others, and I don't want to speak about others, but we are, again, at the tail end of that queue reform effort.
Okay. Mr. Norris, you also highlight this problem with the interconnection queues in your testimony. What do you recommend that Congress needs to do about it?
Thank you for that. I know we're limited on time, so I'll try to be brief. I think while I mentioned that it's hard for other markets to fully replicate what ERCOT is doing, I think there are a lot of lessons there and things that we can do to enable generators that are willing to accept some risk of curtailment to be added to the grid much more quickly. And we've adopted this very sort of conservative, restrictive approach that actually imposes these very high barriers to entry to getting new generators on the system. And so I think there are opportunities to streamline that interconnection service and actually just make it more consistent with the original intent of Energy Resource Interconnection Service that FERC set out in Order 2003.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, the chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. And a lot of my thinking in this area came, a lot of us were at the Library of Congress last fall, and Eric Schmidt, the Google Eric Schmidt, not Senator Eric Schmidt, was presenting to us, and he talked a lot about the demands for AI, the demands for power. In his book, Genesis, he wrote with the last book written by Henry Kissinger, just really lays out the need to win the battle of AI against China. And who's going to control the platform for AI? He didn't say this, but I took away from it. It's like the dollar. Are we going to be the world currency or not? And so, and the biggest driver for AI is the innovators are going to figure it out. But what they need is access to power so they can generate these. And there is trainable AI data centers that can be flexible. But China's not building, they're building others as well that we have to compete with. And we're going to have to be flexible and efficient as much as we possibly can. But to believe that we can stay down the path that we're on in electricity and to defeat China, that I think is like European thinking. Well, let's run the world, let's plan for the world like we want it to be, not like it is. And you deal things in the ivory tower, it's been devastating to Europe right now. Go there and see. And so we have to be responsible, and we have to have, but I think it's imperative that we win the fight for AI. If we don't, then we're going to lose the battle for AI to China. In China building 2 coal plants a week, or 2 coal plant every 2 weeks to support their AI, we're also going to lose the other battle for climate change as well. Unless China has a different climate than we do, and I don't think that's accurate. So, Mr. Black, I want to, in your testimony, you talk about how energy policy is highly regional in nature and how it affects the physics of finance and making and moving electricity. For policymakers, what should we take away from that point?
So we just had a question sort of talking about whose job it is to deal with some of these issues. I will say we're always thinking through how do we regulate as close to the customer as possible from a state perspective. So a lot of the programs that Mr. Norris has studied in presenting, we've had for a number of years. I'm going to age myself, but 25 years ago, I helped develop a tariff called the Customer-Owned Dispatchable Energy Tariff, which is a standby generator tariff that does exactly what Mr. Norris is talking about. So, but that's all through the state level, right? So when we get into these these responsibilities of who can manage the grid and help us improve utilization rates, we would say much of that is at the state level, and we do that through IRPs and again, the careful management and oversight of our state regulators.
So thank you very much. And we're going to have more hearings, and we'll hopefully have people that build these data centers that will just talk about what the risk is if we go down the path that Europe has gone, where they're not building them in Europe. They're not building them. They can't afford to build them in Europe, and that is it set Europe back. Absolutely, their energy policy has set them back. So, Mr. Brickhouse and Mr. Haque, you're in different regions of the country under different regulatory setups. Would you each briefly explain how you plan to meet new growth and power demand and ensure reliability and affordability? Mr. Brickhouse first, and Mr. Haque.
Sure. Thank you. So our process, and actually how Basin was formed more than 65 years ago, it starts with a load forecast. And from that annual load forecast, we will plan out what our generation assets are going to look like in the future. So you get something similar to what Mr. Black was referencing on an integrated resource plan. And Basin's recent history has been rapid growth. Since 2010, we have averaged increase in megawatt-hour sales to our members of about 5% a year. And you're not going to find hardly any other utilities that have grown that rapidly. And over that
Limited amount of time, so
Okay.
Mr. Haque, if you could, I'm running out of time, so.
Sure. PJM is, again, a 14-jurisdiction regional transmission organization, and we have both regulatory paradigms. We have the vertically integrated jurisdictions, about half, and we have restructured jurisdictions, about half. Restructured jurisdictions, they rely on markets to incentivize new resources. Vertically integrated jurisdictions, the same as Mr. Brickhouse, and I think as Mr. Black were describing through integrated resource planning.
So, thank you. And wind and solar is important to this mix. So, matter of fact, you can produce it quicker, is what my colleague from Florida talked about. But the problem is if you incentivize it to the point where people don't build other dispatchable power because you can't be competitive, then we lose in the long term. So in the short term, wind and solar is going to be able, because of the supply chains and others, we're going to need it. But we also need to make sure we don't disincentivize building power to win this battle. So my time has expired, now I yield back.
Thank you much. The chairman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Norris, I want to ask you some questions. I want to focus on something you mentioned in your written testimony, which was that if large energy loads can be a little flexible, it will buy us a lot more time to increase the grid's generation and transmission capacity. And frankly, we're going to need that time because many grid operators have been abysmally slow at getting sources of clean energy hooked up to the grid. So let me ask you this. Can you, Mr. Norris, can you talk about what policy changes to interconnection queues or anything else we need to make to get energy on the grid as quickly as possible, and how important it is to make those changes sooner rather than later? I have 3 questions, so.
Thank you, Congressman. This has been a significant area of research for us, and what's actually interesting about it is how similar the solutions are on the large load side, for the large generator side, to get them onto the grid faster. And the way it works, right, is they look at the maximum output or draw that the generator or the load puts on the system, and they study it, and what happens is it often triggers a lot of upgrades on the system. But if the load or the generator is willing to be flexible, such that it might be curtailed in a small number of hours a year, it can connect to the grid much more quickly. That's what ERCOT does, and that's why their speed to interconnection is twice as fast as every other market. And so with modifications to energy resource interconnection service and making these large load services available, they may be able to connect to the grid much more quickly so that we can win the AI race, as the other member just said.
All right, I guess I'm going to have to go quicker because I actually realized I have 4 questions. With all this increased demand on the grid, how can we best protect residential ratepayers from skyrocketing costs, and how much of this is the federal government's responsibility versus state regulators' responsibility?
Yeah, I think for a lot of these large loads that are coming on the system, they're coming into a paradigm where we had no load growth, and where the traditional paradigm was we meet any new loads at any cost. And the problem is that under this kind of paradigm, with this amount of load this quickly, the rate impacts could be substantial. And so I think you're seeing a number of jurisdictions realize that there need to be guardrails put in place, and ideally, any incremental cost of service to serve the new load for these large loads should be covered by that large load. And I think there are other guardrails that can be put in place, like upfront security. They could post while they're trying to interconnect, and then exit fees as well.
Okay, and then I wanted to go back to those studies I entered into the record earlier, and they show that repealing the IRA's technology-neutral tax credits could increase the price families pay for power in some states by up to 20%. So, Mr. Norris, just because, of course, I question a lot my Republican colleagues, what they describe as facts, but wouldn't that be bad for affordability? Am I correct?
Yes, and there are a few studies out there that are demonstrating this right now. I mean, it's sort of obvious, right? If you pull back incentives for a given activity, you're going to see less of that activity. In this case, that means there's going to be less generation out of the system, and that's going to impose higher costs. And there was a study just released last week by NERA Economic Consulting that found that there would be higher rates of 7% for residential customers in 2026 alone, and I think it was 10% for commercial customers.
Okay. My last question is of Mr. Haque. FERC recently approved PJM's Reliability Resource Initiative, or RRI, which allows a one-time insertion of up to 50 projects into PJM's queue ahead of other resources. I'm very aware of PJM's challenges with getting enough power online, but just ask, if you ask any of my constituents, they'll certainly talk about that. But Mr. Haque, can you confirm that the RRI framework is a one-time solution for PJM, and that the grid operator is dedicated to working diligently to comply with FERC Order 2023 and create an interconnection process that doesn't need these manual interventions to allow energy to access the grid?
I can confirm all of that, Representative. Thank you. The RRI initiative is actually one of 3 different initiatives that we advanced to try and expedite supply trying to come onto the system, and we're grateful for FERC's assistance in approving our proposals. If you think about it, we are going to be in a position next year where we are in our new queue reformed process. Any project that comes through the queue will have a 1 to 2 year turnaround timeframe. It's taken us a few years to sort of unclog the queue and get to that position, but while we're doing that, we have actually created, through the FERC's approval, some additional expedited lanes to try and get resources onto the system to meet this growing demand.
And obviously I'm concerned about this approach of deciding which projects can get onto the grid is going to disincentivize clean energy developers from, ever building generation to serve PJMs again. I know my time has run out, but I did want to say, Mr. Latta, Chairman Latta, I was happy to see, he's not here, I don't think, that Chairman Guthrie talked about the importance of solar and wind power, because every time I hear Trump, he says he wants to get rid of it completely. So it's good that you guys, at least, or I hope, do not agree with Trump in that regard, but we'll see. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired, yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, the vice chairman of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes for questions.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Norris, I'm going to come to you. You made some interesting statements in your testimony about ERCOT has certain advantages. Would you go back through there and state those again for us?
Yeah, so ERCOT makes it much easier for new generators to connect to the grid. And there are different reasons for this, but basically it's come one, come all. They study them, they give them the result of the study, but they don't charge them for the cost of big grid upgrades. So a project can connect at its own risk, and the result is that their speed to market, speed to interconnect is twice as fast as other markets, and they've been adding more capacity, as I mentioned earlier, than any other market by far.
When you say speed to connect is twice as fast, what does that mean? They're able to get up and running in half a day, 1 day, 2 weeks? What does that mean?
Well, these are big assets, so it's a little longer than that, but you're generally talking about on the order of 2 years. When you're talking about the speed we're talking about is from interconnection request to getting online, and so we're talking about 3 years approximately, and in other markets it can take 5 or 6.
Okay, Mr. Brickhouse, I'm going to come to you. With that in mind, and I know, of course, ERCOT, do I recall correctly? I'll ask all of you. There's 9 grids in the country, is that right? 9 various grids? that
in North
about right?
America. There's 9 grid operators in North
9 grid operators, okay. So with that in mind, trying to make things easier to connect to, Mr. Brickhouse, how do y'all fall along those lines? Are you like ERCOT, less like ERCOT, or where do y'all fall in that scenario Mr. Norris just painted?
Well, with respect to connections, as I mentioned earlier, you can get a data center online a lot quicker than you can build a power plant. So our focus lately has been getting power plants online as quick as possible. And so primarily, most of our load is in the Southwest Power Pool. So we'll go through an interconnection process with them. And with Pioneer 4, which is 580 megawatts of dispatchable natural gas generation we're finishing up, we have actually elected to connect to the grid prior to the final cost estimate of what grid upgrades will need to take place.
And is that a 2 or 3 year process?
Yes.
Okay. How about you, Mr. Hogg, 2 or 3 year process?
Our process is different than ERCOT's process. If you are load that wants to connect to the system, we feel like there's an obligation to serve that load, but our processes are different than the others.
So what time frame does it take?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What time frame does it take? If you're going to hook up, you identify load, what's it going to take, a year, 2, 3?
That is dependent. Okay, it is the load that wants to interconnect to the system. It'll be dependent on a series of different factors, and it'll be dependent on, first of all, the transmission system, whether the transmission system can actually accommodate
Bear the load.
and so we'll study it and see if the transmission system can actually accommodate the load. And then there are some, we'll just characterize them as adventurous arrangements that some of these data centers are trying to enter into, which then adds to the potential complexity with the possibility of this concept of co-location.
So you're studying right now about AI, aren't you?
Yes, we are.
Okay, how about you, Mr. Brickhouse, studying right now about AI?
Yes, we expect to connect AI.
Did either one of y'all, and I'll start back with you, Mr. Brickhouse, have to knock offline a coal plant?
Have we knocked offline a coal plant?
Have y'all had to take a coal plant offline?
No.
How about y'all, Mr. Hogg?
For the purposes of AI,
No, just in general.
yes, we've had quite a bit of coal retire on our system.
So let me go back to you, Mr. Brickhouse, not just for AI, but have you had to take a coal plant off just in general?
We do have periodic outages, and then when, with the wind resources across the Great Plains, periodically.
But you've not decommissioned the coal plant?
We have not decommissioned a coal plant. One of our original coal assets was actually decommissioned in the 80s, which I don't think you're referring to, but that was for different reasons.
Well, I don't look that old, is that what you're trying to say? I like this guy. So, and I guess we'll come to you, Mr. Black. How do you feel about commissioning, decommissioning some of the coal plants? You got 13 seconds.
Sure, we have retired some coal plants, but we have some coal plants obviously still in our fleet that are incredibly useful for us, and we've extended the life of those recently in our IRPs to meet this demand.
Okay, I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California's 50th District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks for holding the hearing on this issue. This is something I've been looking forward to for a while, where we can have a discussion about kind of what the challenge is and what we might do to come up and meet it as a country. It will be a challenge to keep the lights on and keep costs low, given what we have this unprecedented increase in energy demand from data centers, manufacturing, electrification, population growth. I think we've all acknowledged that. I don't believe we're prepared to handle this demand as is. We can't just address the problem by building more of any one particular kind of energy, and anyone who thinks otherwise, I think, is probably maybe being a little bit ideological, which I don't want to be. New, cleaner generation has to play a role in meeting the energy demand. We also need to make significant investments in our electric grid and pipeline infrastructure so that power can be moved more efficiently from where it's abundant to where it's needed, and we need to use all the tools in the toolbox to meet the challenge. But we do fail if we don't get shovels in the ground and start building what we need at the pace we need to build it, at a pace that meets the urgency of the challenge. And every day we waste will increase costs, give our competitors an edge, make us more open to unreliability, and make us less safe. In the 1970s, when many of the first environmental rules were passed, our priority was to stop dirty, destructive projects. We were on defense. Today, if we want to continue to reduce our emissions and build the infrastructure of the future while reducing costs for taxpayers, we need to go on the offense and reform our laws to meet the challenges of today. As we've spoken before, that means permit reform in many, many different contexts. I look forward to working with my colleagues on real solutions that will strengthen the electric grid, drive down costs, and build a more resilient future for our constituents. Mr. Norris, I've put forward several bills to incentivize grid planning, to harden utility infrastructure, more efficiently site and permit national interest transmission lines. And one of those bills is my bipartisan Speed and Reliability Act, which streamlines permitting for large transmission lines that relieve grid congestion and improve reliability. Can you talk about the costs and reliability benefits to identifying the highest value projects and streamlining permits for those projects?
Absolutely, and thanks for your leadership, Congressman. I think a good case study on this actually is in our region in the Carolinas, where the industry worked with Duke Energy on a proactive transmission upgrade. It was to the Eastern Carolinas, and the reason is because the least cost resources available to the system are located there. It's large-scale solar power plants, but that area of the grid was relatively weak, and so they went through a proactive public policy-driven process. They got approval from the Utilities Commission, $560 million, but it unlocked gigawatts of projects. And not only was that expected to reduce rates overall, but actually could improve reliability because, on the hottest summer days, right, you get a really nice solar profile, so that could actually help support the summer peaks. So I think that's a good example, and I think your bill there is a no-brainer, right? When you have to go through two separate permitting processes, both from FERC and the Department of Energy, it makes a lot of sense to consolidate into one because, again, if we're gonna meet this load growth in a fast manner, we have to be getting this transmission built as quickly as possible.
Thanks, I appreciate you being here. I also, we have a Duke connection, which so I'm listening to you extra hard. Appreciate that very much. Mr. Haque, I wonder if you could talk about interregional transmission and the importance of investing in the electric grid. How's that complementary to building new generation sources, and how do you think about that, both regional and interregional transmission?
And so certainly, the build-out of transmission will be essential to getting our resources, especially our renewable resources that are in the queue, connected to the power grid. The more transmission that you build out, we build out for reliability, we build out for market efficiency. We're advancing down this path of long-term planning that was approved by the FERC, but the more transmission you build out, theoretically, the less that renewable developers need to pay in upgrades, and so that will be helpful there. Interregional, we currently, we export quite a bit of power to our neighbors. February, we were exporting, in fact, we exported 14,000 megawatts during a cold weather snap to our neighbor, the Mid-Continent ISO. And so there's actually quite a bit of interregional capability that exists today. And so we will continue to study this to see if there's any
What
additional.
interests me is that PJM has determined that it's not just about building transmission in your region for reliability, for consumer service. You've decided that as part of your business, it's important for you to plan and to execute on interregional transmission, right?
We have, again, quite a bit of interregional transfer capability, and we will continue to analyze that. We're actually doing a joint study with the Mid-Continent ISO right now. And of course, FERC Order 1920 actually mandates that we look at interregional planning in tandem with our long-term planning framework.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for your leadership, and thanks to all witnesses. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama's 6th District for 5 minutes for questions.
I appreciate the witnesses being here, and I want to raise some questions about the reliability of the grid, particularly as it regards transformers. A couple of years ago, there was an attack on transformers in North Carolina that shut down power for about 4 or 5 days. And one of the things that I found out was that they had to salvage or scavenge transformers from around the country. They didn't have transformers in reserve to get those back up. Mr. Black, I should say Mr. Brickhouse, You flagged these concerns in your testimony, and I'm concerned that we have a major supply chain problem in our ability to manufacture transformers here to meet our needs if we were to have a catastrophic event, a coronal mass ejection, a geomagnetic issue that could shut down huge numbers of huge portions of our power grid. So I'd just like for you to comment on that, and particularly something that President Trump mentioned in his speech last night about the need to declare, I think, critical minerals, rare earth elements as critical to our national security.
On the transformer issue, I think it extends a little bit further to breakers as well. And part of the issue that you're having is with these large loads that I think everyone has talked about today. A data center needs similar equipment as a power plant. We need breakers and transformers when we build a power plant to get that energy on the grid, and to receive that energy, a data center needs breakers and transformers. So with the advent of these large loads in the form of data centers, you have almost double demand for the similar equipment that are needed by the two facilities.
If we had a catastrophic event, are you gentlemen familiar with an event that occurred in 1859 called the Carrington event? It was the worst coronal mass ejection ever recorded. If we had an event like that, Lloyd's of London has done an assessment that it would there'd be about 30 million people in North America that would be without power for anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 years. If we were to have something along that scale, how long would it take us to replace the transformers, the breakers, to get our grid back up and operational?
It would be a considerable period of time depending on how wide the impacts were. We did have a lot, well, it causes the northern lights in North Dakota, actually, and there was significant activities within the past 12 months on those, and the grid operators, especially Western area Power Administration, watched that closely.
What I'm trying to make, sir, is that we don't have the manufacturing capacity in this country. We don't have the skilled labor. We don't have access to the critical minerals that we need to build our own transformers. We don't have an adequate supply of transformers. Most of the transformers we get either come from Mexico or China. We would be in a very, very serious situation that would, Lloyd's of London, I think, would indicate a potential massive loss of life, depending on when it occurred. And that's a huge concern to me. And what happened in North Carolina, Mr. Black, the guy goes in, shoots up the oil tanks, and would cool the transformers, and we lose that whole station. Does Southern Company have a plan if we were to have not a catastrophic event, but a major event?
Certainly, GMDs have been on our radar for quite some time, and physical security, like you mentioned in the Carolinas, there are something we plan for and test and prepare for all the time. I think your sensitivity around, in the midst of all this growth, the supply and demand challenges. Right. We've seen it ebb some, the challenges since COVID. But there's a lot going on, right? And the international stress on the supply chain is there for sure. So we're preparing for it.
Yeah, my concern too is we're in an arms race for artificial intelligence, and I'm looking at the NERC report on the high risk areas and the medium risk areas, and it's clear we don't have the power capacity to build the data systems that we need in order to win that arms race with China. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey's 8th District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Clean energy is the only source of new generation capable of meeting electricity demand. A report by the Clean Grid Initiative suggests that we need to rapidly deploy clean energy generation and transmission faster than we currently are. And 94% of proposed power generation waiting to be interconnected is zero carbon. But instead, the president's energy policy focused primarily on oil and gas, while while ignoring clean energy sources such as solar and wind. In New Jersey, we've already seen the consequences of the president's prioritization of oil and gas as the future of renewables like wind have been put at risk. We should all be committed to accelerating our clean energy production and connecting it to the grid as quickly as possible. Instead, Republicans and Trump are focused on repealing critical programs that invest in renewable energy generation, putting the future of clean energy at risk. The Inflation Reduction Act provides certainty for the energy industry, allowing us to plan for future energy demands. Investing in clean energy generation is critical for ensuring the future reliability of our grid. Not only does repealing the IRA jeopardize the future of renewables, it will also increase energy cost for consumers and our constituents. The IRA is on track to save Americans up to $38 billion on their electricity bills. Mr. Brickhouse, during your opening remarks, you made a reference to consistent, reliable policies. And I believe it is safe to say that you would agree that the energy industry needs certainty. Is that correct?
It's consistent policy is helpful, correct.
And having some predictability is helpful in terms of these long-term investments.
Having predictability, is that what?
Predictability in terms of future policies is helpful in making these long-term investments. Is that correct?
Yes.
So wouldn't repealing the IRA make it harder for the industry and states to make the investments needed for projected demands for reliable, affordable electricity? Yes or no?
I think that depends.
I think the answer is yes, but I'll move on. Mr. Norris, would repealing the IRA, as our colleagues across the aisle seek to do, make life more or less affordable for Americans?
According to economists, based on studies they've conducted in the past couple months, it will lead to an increase in electricity rates, and the NERA study says 7% for residential customers in 2026, 10% for commercial customers in 2026.
So the answer would be yes, it would make life it'd be less affordable for Americans.
Correct.
And how disruptive would the repeal of the IRA be to the long-term investments currently underway across the country to increase our access to, again, reliable, affordable electricity?
I want to highlight one resource in particular, which is nuclear power. And I think it's unequivocal that, it's a resource that is still above cost. Georgia did a great service in some sense by paying above market for those 2 reactors at Vogtle. But there still has to be some cost premium paid to get those resources online. They're heavily reliant on federal subsidies and incentives. And so if there is a repeal of the IRA tech-neutral tax credit for nuclear or any impact on the Loan Programs Office, there will not be a nuclear renaissance in the United States. And similar principles apply to enhanced geothermal and other possible firm baseload or clean baseload sources in the future.
And to achieve energy dominance in this country, shouldn't we want an all-the-above approach? And shouldn't we continue these investments that are already underway and funded by the IRA?
One of the, I think, could have been bipartisan opportunities in the IRA was to shift from resource-specific tax incentives to a technology-neutral structure. And so the whole idea there was to make it an all-of-the-above approach. And so I think that was a key design. And again, for these advanced resources, it's going to be critical to keep those in place if we want to see them move forward.
Thank you. Mr. Haque, I understand that wind, solar, and storage make up the vast majority of resources in PJM's queue, and PJM is currently undergoing queue reform efforts. So let me ask you this. If the IRA's tax credits were to be repealed, wouldn't the vast majority of resources in PJM's interconnection queue see a substantial amount of their financial incentives erased?
Now, Representative, we haven't studied what potential repeal of the IRA would do to the queue. I have read studies independently that say that repeal of the IRA would create financial challenges for those resources to come to eventual fruition. And right now, we've got a challenge because we have actually cleared through our queue about 50,000 megawatts, 50 gigawatts of primarily renewable resources that are having challenges related to financing, that are having challenges related to supply chain, that are having challenges related to state and federal siting. And so I think that, pursuant to your point, that this would probably create additional financial strain on those resources should the IRA be repealed, but again, nothing that I've specifically stated.
Yeah, that's why we should work to make sure that we continue the IRA and see its full implementation, not repeal it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia's 12th District for 5 minutes for questions.
being here today and sharing your expertise on this important challenge that we have. The United States has an abundant energy supply, and the question is not do we have enough energy resources, but can we produce energy at the levels needed to meet the nation's future demand? My state of Georgia is the top state to do business in 12 years in a row, and with that, new manufacturing and data centers are coming to the state. This is leading to high demand for the grid, and we must continue to ensure we can provide reliable, affordable energy as we power our nation's needs. In my district, the 12th District of Georgia, we have Plant Vogtle, the largest nuclear energy clean power station in the country. Nuclear energy will play a critical role in meeting our growing needs to ensure U.S. leadership in the next generation economy. The ADVANCE Act was signed into law last year and included my legislation, the Nuclear Licensing Efficiency Act, which will drive more efficient, timely, and predictable reviews of reactor licenses. Mr. Black, thank you for being here today. Can you discuss the considerations Southern Company takes into account when seeking to invest in nuclear facilities and how you see the role of nuclear energy in our future energy mix?
Well, we're certainly proud of Vogtle and glad we have it online, particularly in this moment of radical expansion of our grid. It is operationally a fantastic resource and provides a lot of sort of electrical benefits to our system that enables us to take even more customers to our system. I think the AP 1000 is a solution that we understand. Its risks are understood, and I think it's a solution that we and our nation should think through in expanding its development.
Right. We know how to build them. I mean, it was 30 years.
Yes.
Before we built, and this is somewhat of a modular project. I mean, it's made off. A lot of it's made off site and then brought in and erected, and we can continue probably to improve on that. But at least we now have the workforce, we have the capability, we know we can do it, and we know that thing's going to be running there for a long, long time. Mr. Brickhouse, in my state, Oglethorpe Power is a wholesale provider of energy for electric co-ops, and they tell me that it is critical for reliability of the grid. They have the ability to run their dispatchable baseload assets like nuclear, but also their coal plants and natural gas generation. During the Biden administration, the EPA's Clean Power Plan 2.0 would only make it harder and more expensive for cooperatives to maintain reliability of the grid. Can you walk us through how the EPA regulations on power plants are factored into Basin Electric members' planning and investment decisions, and how that may impact the ratepayer and reliability in your areas?
Certainly, thank you. And our Chief Financial Officer, who's with me today, used to work at Oglethorpe, so we have some things in common there. I think the most illustrative example for the committee would be that a baseload coal plant, you want it to be available and online, or available at least 90% of the time. If you have to go and do carbon sequestration on that, you're going to have a parasitic load of about 25% of the output of that unit, and you're combining another industrial process to that unit, and the combined, you're not going to have 100% reliability for your carbon capture, which is going to bring down the entire availability of that power plant.
In other words, put you pretty much out of business there.
Or makes your rates a lot more expensive.
Yeah. I'd like to circle back on the role of nuclear energy. Mr. Haque, as an organized market, PJM operates very differently than vertically integrated structure of the state of Georgia. When operating efficiently, the market should send price signals that invite potential nuclear developers to enter the region. Given growing energy demands in the market, there should be an opportunity for more nuclear energy to help meet future energy needs of the region. What are the barriers you're seeing in PJM's region to expand the use of nuclear energy?
Thank you, Representative. I think we're actually seeing some good movement on nuclear in the PJM region right now. And so we are seeing particularly nuclear uprates to existing facilities. There was a recent announcement of the reopening of on what was formerly 3 Mile Island, now called the Crane Clean Energy Center in the state of Pennsylvania. So we are seeing some good movement in the nuclear space. When you have these supply-demand challenges, means the prices go up. And so when prices go up, it sends a price signal to those who would want to invest in our market, and specifically invest not on the backs of consumers, but private dollars into the marketplace to build a new unit. That is the sort of crux of what the markets are, and we are actually seeing some of that activity already in our footprint after sending just, frankly, one high clearing price.
Well, thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Virginia's 4th District. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Latta and Ranking Member Castor, for holding this hearing on how we can meet our growing demand for reliable and affordable electricity. I'm glad to hear Chairman Guthrie in his questions earlier say that that should include clean energy sources like wind and solar. I agree. So I'm a member of Gen X, and I grew up on Schoolhouse Rock. And I think everybody here knows and is very familiar with I'm Just a Bill. But my favorite episode actually was the Energy Blues. And I can't help, as we've been listening to your testimony and the questions, I've had energy blues rolling through my mind. Maybe one day I'll ask for unanimous consent to put the lyrics in the record. I'm not going to sing it, but I do want to highlight a couple of them. Energy. Sometimes I think I'm running out of energy. Seems like we use an awful lot for heating and lighting and driving, reading and writing and jiving. Energy, you'd think we'd be saving it up. It goes through a history of the energy sources and the increase in demand in American history. It says, energy, we're looking to try and find some new kinds. Energy, exploring to try and make a new find. Nuclear and thermal and solar, if we miss, we'll get colder and colder. Energy, we've got to stop using you up. Then it introduced my little kid self to the concept of energy efficiency. So don't get cross when Mama says turn that extra light out. Just turn it off till we find us a fuel that never runs out. If everyone tries a bit harder, our fuel will go farther and farther. Energy, we're going to be stretching you out. So just want to remind you that our childhood shows, our childhood jingles are actually very educational and still very relevant. So Mr. Brickhouse, I think I misheard you in one of your answers, and I want to make sure I set the record straight. In your written testimony, you urged Congress to keep the investment tax credit and production tax credit. Is that correct?
Correct, and in my oral testimony, I referenced that as well.
Okay, I thought I might have misheard you. I thought I heard something that contradicted that, so I just wanted to make sure that your position on that was clear. In Virginia, we have the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, which is an incredible example of how offshore wind can be a powerful economic engine for the entire region. And it's something that has bipartisan support that grew out of bipartisan, the Virginia Clean Economy Act and related wind legislation that we passed. And nationally, offshore wind has brought $25 billion in new investments to ports, factories, manufacturing facilities, the electrical grid, and jobs. You all have discussed the demand for electricity in the region is expected to grow significantly in the coming years for a wide variety of reasons. And there are currently offshore wind projects like the one in Virginia and elsewhere that could contribute to PJM's grid. Mr. Norris, could you explain how, despite Chairman Guthrie's view that wind and solar are necessary and we should continue down that path, can you talk about how President Trump's executive order halting new federal leases and permits for wind energy and the massive uncertainty it creates for businesses will impact PJM's ability to meet the growing demand for energy in the coming years?
Yeah, well, one of the great things about offshore wind is it actually has a pretty high capacity factor and a capacity value because it actually produces on winter mornings when we need power. So it has a nice profile. What's happening is that some states have said, we're willing to pay above market to get the offshore wind industry kickstarted. Kind of like Georgia said, we're willing to pay above market to get these 2 new reactors online. And that's a great service to the country that they're performing because offshore wind is an immense resource. It could offer a lot of energy in the future. It does require some upfront investment, right, to get it down the cost curve. But if you're going to get rid of the leases, then it has no possibility of growing as an industry. And you're basically preventing those states from saying, we want to develop this resource.
Thank you. And I'll just note in my final seconds that one of the quickest ways that we can help to address the growing demand is to also help mitigate that demand through things like energy efficiency programs that are the fastest and cheapest way to help address demand and slow its growth. So you all touched on that in your testimony, and I just wanted to reiterate that point, given that we're taking some opposite actions here in Congress last week and this week on the House floor. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio's 12th District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will start my questions this morning. Thank you all for being here with my good friend and always my chairman from the great state of Ohio, Mr. Haque. Mr. Haque, I'd like to discuss some concerning trends we're seeing with operators' interconnection queues. It's been talked a little bit about here this morning. PJM's existing installed capacity mix is overwhelmingly made up of dispatchable power generation, such as natural gas, nuclear, and coal. However, 97% of PJM's queue capacity comes from renewable generation. Mr. Haque, in your testimony, you note that unlike traditional thermal generation, renewable resources do not provide certain essential reliability services that are necessary to balance and maintain the power grid. Do you have any concerns with the lack of dispatchable power generation entering PJM's interconnection queue, and are there enough of these projects to offset premature retirements and meet rising growth demand?
Thank you, Representative. Great to see you. We certainly have concern with not having dispatchable resources in the generation interconnection queue. And the grid is a machine, and it is a machine governed by the laws of physics. And this is not us. This is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, who has published papers, published analyses that say that we need essential reliability services, which are things like control things like ramp and voltage and things that, as a lawyer, I don't quite understand, but that are necessary. And so we do need our spinning mass resources. We do need our thermal resources, nuclear, coal, gas, to continue to run a power grid the size of PJM interconnection. Having said all that, again, we need these dispatchable resources to find their way on the system. We can integrate more renewables onto our system. There are grid operators, there are grids that run on more renewable resources than we currently run on. Now, what that sort of balance is and what that threshold is, we're not quite there yet, but we do need dispatchable resources to run our system.
All right, thank you. Mr. Haque, again, I recently introduced the Grid Power Act with Senator Hoeven of North Dakota and Senator Todd Young of Indiana. Our bill provides a process that would give grid operators the authority to identify and expedite the consideration of essential projects that will protect our grid's reliability and provide the power needed to meet America's growing demand. As you know, the queue backlog isn't unique to PJM. Depending upon the region, projects may sit and wait in the interconnected queues for over 5 years before they can even begin their feasibility and impact studies. I appreciate that PJM is ahead of the curve here, and as you've said, you're making good progress getting through the queue backlog. But I also understand that last year, PJM cleared 50 gigawatts of resources through their queue, and developers are not getting those projects built. Mr. Haque, can you briefly discuss why PJM's Reliability Resource Initiative is so critical to improving grid reliability and maintaining resource adequacy? First question, and how can grid operators, FERC, and Congress build off this initiative to get more reliable generation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think grid operators across the country are facing what we are facing, which is this supply-demand challenge and clogged queues. Again, I'd like to think that we are ahead of the curve. Again, I have not benchmarked us against other grid operators, but again, next year we will be through our queue reform effort, 1 to 2 year turnaround timeframe. But in the meantime, we needed to create an opportunity for resources that are more shovel-ready, that can best contribute to reliability, to find their way into the queue, because otherwise you would have to get in the back of a line starting in 2026. And we need those resources now. Now, there's been a misnomer out there that these are going to be effectively fossil resources, and that is actually not true. In fact, what we know right now is that nuclear uprates and this Crane Clean Energy Center, this TMI, reopening are going to find their way into the RRI, the Reliability Resource Initiative. And we think we are hearing anecdotally that we'll have some storage projects as well that find their way through to the RRI. So to us, again, we are agnostic in terms of the resource type. Every resource type has its capability, and we have to be sort of honest about the physics of the grid and how it operates. And so that's our RRI, which I think is very akin to the legislation that you introduced.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California's 7th District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank you and the Ranking Member Castor for having this hearing today, and I want to thank the witnesses for joining us today. I am particularly concerned by President Trump's unprecedented power grab to exert control over independent agencies, including FERC. Congress created the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as an independent agency to insulate its decisions from political influence. Mr. Norris, can you very briefly explain FERC's role in regulating electricity, how that impacts Americans' electricity bills, and why FERC's impartiality is so important?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. I like to think of FERC as sort of the referee that makes sure that markets are functioning properly and calls fouls where they take place. But the whole point is to have efficient markets, right, that are competitive to ensure that the least cost electricity that's reliable is available to the customers. And so that's the role. I think it is concerning. Look, I've been part of a number of FERC proceedings, a lot of state PUC proceedings. I can't remember ever hearing a participant in one of those proceedings say, we wish this was more politicized and had less quality review, right? So I think when you're talking about a business context with decisions that are this critical, you need substantial expertise, and that's exactly why we have FERC, because they bring that to bear.
Right. Now, you worked as a solar developer, adding new energy capacity to the grid to help meeting rising demand. So I guess from an energy project developer's perspective, what would be your top concern if the president had ultimate authority over FERC rulemaking?
I could think of a variety of concerns. I mean, I think even just from a speed of business standpoint, right? I mean, it already takes a long time to get these proceedings done, but if you add another layer of review and approval, that could make the process even less efficient. I think knowing that the regulators are impartial and technology neutral is critical to ensure that there's business confidence and that you attract investment from a variety of different sectors. So those two issues, I think speed of business and the lack of impartiality would be the two biggest concerns.
So every member of this committee should be gravely concerned about protecting FERC's independence, correct?
I believe so.
So otherwise, FERC's policies could shift dramatically from each new administration. Fundamentally, I don't disagree with my Republican colleagues about the challenges we are facing. The chair has called this hearing to highlight the need to meet rising energy demand while also lowering energy costs for consumers. That's a goal we all share. But if your objective is to add more affordable generation to the grid, it doesn't take an energy expert to tell you that repealing federal incentives that lower the cost of building and operating new energy projects is counterproductive. It was just reported that Republicans will start drafting a bill next week that will repeal federal incentives for new energy projects, which are supporting the build-out of affordable energy across the country, including in many of my Republican colleagues' districts. Mr. Norris, what effect would this repeal have on the electric grid in, let's say, southeastern U.S.?
I think there are a variety of potential impacts. I will note that a key component of Duke Energy's resource plan going out 10 to 15 years now is nuclear power expansion, building on what's happened to Vogtle. And if those incentives are repealed, I think it's quite unlikely that there will be any nuclear expansion that takes place in the Southeast. Offshore wind is another impact. They're planning for that as part of their carbon plan, integrated resource plan. That would probably be taken off the table. And of course, it would make solar and wind more expensive as well. So it's likely to increase rates, and it may have impacts on reliability.
Okay. I want to switch gears, Mr. Norris, to talk about load flexibility. I'm a strong proponent of virtual power plants because I believe they have the potential to meet rising demand faster and cheaper than many other options. Our utility in Sacramento, SMUD, is a leader on virtual power plants, but many utilities are skeptical at that virtual power plants can reliably meet demand. Mr. Norris, what would you say to a utility that is skeptical of virtual power plants?
Well, you know, the largest form of a virtual power plant is what we call demand response, and it plays a very substantial role in some markets. So in the Midwest Independent System Operator, demand response contributes about 10% of their overall system peak. That is quite substantial. And then in many other markets, it's above 5%. You know, in Duke Energy, where I'm based, you know, they have a power pair program where most of the subscribers actually allow the utility to have direct control over the battery storage on site. So in this case, you can actually have the utility knowing that it's able to operate because they can send a direct control signal to that device.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and I ran out of time. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas's 11th district for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's amazing to me that we still have a math problem between the two sides of the aisle here, but we do. And I want to try to address this math problem. Last year, when I asked Secretary of Energy, Ms. Granholm, how much energy does the United States consume, she couldn't answer the question. And when you go back a couple of years ago, you see that the consumption has actually risen by about 0.5% annually. But Department of Energy, the same one that Ms. Granholm ran, actually has predicted that it's going to be between 5 to 6% increase in consumption in the next 10 years. And yet, we're still talking about unreliable sources here, which is just unbelievable to me. And the billions of dollars that are being pushed out because of the IRA, we'll get to those questions, but the answer to that question was 4,292 terawatt hours in 2022 with a 0.5% increase annually. But that's changing. So, Mr. Brickhouse, what I want to talk to you about, first off, is in your testimony, you talk about tripling of increase for natural gas demand. And I want to hear what's holding us back from using that as a provider.
Well, from Basin Electric's perspective, nothing is preventing us from using it. Since 2010, again, we've grown 5% annually each year on average. Since then, we have added roughly 1,000 megawatts of natural gas generation to our portfolio. At the same time, thankfully for the wind resources in our service territory, we've added a similar amount of wind generation. As we look out through the balance of this year, we'll add 600 megawatts of dispatchable natural gas generation, and then we'll spend $4 billion between now and 2030 to add another 1,500 megawatts of natural gas generation.
What's the most important quality to you? Is it affordability? Is it reliability? Is it this notion that somehow one form or another is cleaner? I mean, what's the most important as a deliverer of electricity? What is the most important characteristic?
Well, I think anybody that joins the electric utility industry, we're a public service industry, which I think is a noble calling, and our objective is to produce safe and reliable and affordable power in an environmentally responsible manner. I think everyone at this table that's employed by a utility, that's our tagline.
And natural gas can do that and is that with
most definitely
40% of the production of and Mr. Black, permitting reform.
Yes.
What I was trying to get at, what's holding us back from using that? Tell us about the detrimental effects of not having permitting reform to deliver affordable, reliable, clean energy.
Sure, yeah, there are three fairly specific things that we could do to amend, this process, the Clean Water Act and NEPA and judicial reform to prevent litigation and uncertainty around infrastructure projects. And I think the important point of all this is, and you asked a great question of what's the constraint right now, and I checked gas prices this morning, they were a little less than $3 per MMBTU, and pipelines are the constraint, right? There's a finite amount of space in a pipe, and if we don't have enough pipes, you get to a point where you have things like basis blowout, which is the cost of transportation blows out 10 times more than the cost of gas. So our need is to build the infrastructure so that we don't create our own constraint and we can get access to that today, sub $4 gas.
I was just trying to Google gas prices in Europe, and I'm sure we can do that relatively quick, but it's not $3 an MCF, it's much higher than that. Mr. Haque, in the last 45 seconds, any expanded thoughts on permitting and how we can deliver for the needs that we know? We're in an energy expansion. That's where we are.
We support permitting reform. Anything we can do to get energy infrastructure built more expeditiously, whether that's generation or transmission, will be extremely helpful. One additional factor that we didn't discuss with respect, I appreciated Mr. Brickhouse and Mr. Black's responses. I think policy also has, and specifically decarbonization policy, is specifically in the gas industry right now. It could be the cheapest resource possible to build out and will also, help with grid reliability in tandem with the renewable resources that we are going to naturally see find their way onto the system. But if there's a policy overhang that creates a risk premium that is really too high for investors to invest in, that is sort of another factor on top of what has already been referenced that creates challenges for natural gas generation to get built out on the system.
Thank you very much. Time has expired. Yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York's 20th District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad that there is a bipartisan recognition of the impending challenges facing our electricity system to meet growing demand. But we are doing ourselves a disservice if we continue to ignore demand-side solutions. Mr. Norris, I appreciated your testimony because I believe we need to incentivize energy efficiency, demand response, and smarter grid management. Reducing peak demand allows our existing generation resources to be stretched further. So, Mr. Norris, can you make the case for reducing peak demand as one of the fastest and most cost-effective strategies we can implement to match near-term growth projections?
That's correct. And I can expand on that. So
if you would, please.
The cheapest form of a megawatt is a negawatt, right? So not having the need to deliver the megawatt. And so there are a growing number of loads on the system that could be flexible, right? So they could be deferred or they could be front-loaded by a couple hours, because these system peaks that we're talking about, there are on average events that are approximately 2 hours. The most trickiest is when they occur during winter mornings, and that's from 6 to 8 a.m. or 6 to 9 a.m. is the period that's well-defined for a lot of the jurisdictions in the Eastern Interconnect. And so for flexibility of 2 to 3 hours, for example, running your hot water heater before you wake up so that your water is already warm and ready to go, so you don't have to run it, right, like when that peak is occurring, we can get more headroom out of the system out of that. And I think the biggest opportunity may be from these large centralized new loads that are coming in, because especially if they already have their own on-site power and they're able to run that for a few hours a year, then we could add a lot more of that load a lot more quickly.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And unfortunately, demand-side policies are not the only tools being ignored by the Trump administration. We really are going to need every available electron to meet our needs. It is hard to believe that the administration is so brazenly dismissing the importance of wind, of solar, and of storage. Excluding wind and solar from Energy Dominance Council's launch and making it harder to permit wind projects on both federal and private lands is completely antithetical to any claim that we need to rapidly expand our electricity system. Certainly renewables have supply chain and permitting challenges, but so do gas plants, with turbines currently being ordered for delivery in 2029. So, Mr. Norris, since wind and solar and storage resources make up the bulk of the interconnection queue and are able to be deployed most quickly amongst new resources, do you think there is a disconnect in the administration's position of disadvantaging these resources while also seeking to encourage near-term load growth?
Yes, I think it's worth noting. So, in Texas, for example, they've seen record summer peaks in the past 2 years. At the same time, they've added record amounts of new capacity, and most of those additions were solar and batteries. And so I think most analysts have concluded that if ERCOT had not added that solar and storage as fast as they did, there would have been rolling blackouts in the summer periods during those summer peaks. So solar and storage can contribute to reliability. It is doing so in a number of markets. And wind as well. It actually balances out the solar profile oftentimes because you can still get decent wind resource in those winter mornings. So I think what you said is generally accurate.
We also know policy stability is needed to properly plan for and make energy investments. There have been several independent studies finding that repeal of clean energy tax incentives will result in major cost increases for our American families and businesses. And creating uncertainty about the future availability of these credits is already having a chilling effect on private sector investments. So, Mr. Norris, if we need projects to be built as quickly and at the lowest cost possible, how does tax credit policy uncertainty discourage investment and upend planning?
We're already hearing of impacts. There are active procurements taking place in the Southeast right now for new solar and solar plus storage resources. And even the uncertainty of not knowing where the tax incentives are going to land has resulted in developers pulling projects out of those RFPs, which means necessarily the cost of those procurements is going to increase. And so even the uncertainty before we even decide if we actually repeal them is already having an impact. But it's just kind of basic economics, right? If you pull back incentives from a given activity, you're going to see less of that activity. In that case, this means that you're going to see less generators added to the system.
Thank you. And Mr. Black, there is a strong bipartisan support for nuclear energy on the committee. Can you explain the role the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office played in supporting the development of Plant Vogtle?
And if you could answer that quickly.
Yes, it provided hundreds of millions of dollars of benefit in Vogtle, the process, the buy down of that loan.
I appreciate that. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. The gentleman yields back. And the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee's 1st District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'll start with Mr. Black. Tech companies make a tremendous amount of money by running their own supercomputers at data centers. And it seemed to me that they'd want to focus their resources on building these data centers rather than getting into the power business. So why do you think these tech companies are going behind the meter? Because they could buy wholesale power from utilities or buy utilities or at regular rates or a negotiated rate.
I think it's a great question, and I think in parts of the country where maybe they are finding it difficult to find available power that is affordable, that is a solution. I think it's likely a near-term solution. Again, I waxed on about the benefit of the integrated grid, and I think the one-off co-location solutions may be short-term, but long-term, I think the unassailable benefits of the way we provide power will be recognized.
Yeah, that was my next follow-up. What would the benefits be to these tech companies or individual ratepayers or the system as a whole when adding these new loads like the data centers in front of the meter instead of behind the meter?
So the benefits of these customers and the growth and the amount of generation they require, done right, charged right with the right tariffs, allow us to build a system that indeed puts downward pressure on rates. And it's around some of the conversations Mr. Norris has had in around that utilization rate. So I need fewer resources to produce more electricity. Well, that puts downward pressure on each unit produced of electricity. So it can be a fantastic thing.
Yeah, okay, thank you, sir. Mr. Haque, different types of computing facilities, whether they be cryptocurrency mining facilities, AI computing, or otherwise, they have different demand needs. And as our committee considers these policies based on growing load demand, would there be any need to define these facilities differently based on their differing demand needs?
It's a great question, Representative. I think one thing that needs to be examined is this load and specifically, we'll just characterize it as costs and other obligations that it creates. And so, we've spent a lot of time with our stakeholder community and within our stakeholder process talking about this load in particular, how big it is, how quickly it's coming on to the system. You talked about, behind the meter opportunities as well as in front of the meter opportunities for these folks to come on. And look, it's a good story. It's a good story for the nation to have these data centers and to have this growth. But simultaneously, I do think we need to think about whether there needs to be, additional, we'll just call it, for us, tariff structures or revisions to deal with this load coming on, specifically, their cost for the system. And, for instance, whether they're paying their fair share of transmission upgrades, whether they're paying their fair share of ancillary services, which is a service within, our grid framework. And so I think you're bringing up an important point. I think it's something that deserves analysis.
Yeah. We talked a little bit a few minutes ago, PJM covers just a sliver of my district, and then TVA, covers the vast majority. And you talked about the Winter Storm Elliott, where there was a surge in demand. It affected my district tremendously, and that allowed you to get that waiver to meet the demand, sell excess power to TVA on the open market. And while we don't need all plants to be in use at the same time, it's kind of like when you lose weight and you have your closet and you don't throw those clothes away. You take them upstairs and you put them in a closet, and then you got your overweight clothes and then you got your skinny clothes. And it's kind of the same way with this power structure, you don't want to turn all of it off or get rid of it all at once. Do you agree?
I agree with that. I have historically been a weight fluctuator, so I do have my heavy suits and my skinny suits.
Well, we all do. I just go upstairs to shop.
But I also agree fundamentally with the premise. And look, the tighter we get on supply, the less we're going to be able to export to our neighbors. And we have been historically, when the weather gets rough, especially these last few winters, we have been able to export to our neighbors in order for them to keep the lights on. And so the tighter we get with supply, we have generally been the sort of the grid in the Eastern Interconnect that has had the most robust supply. The tighter we get, the less we're going to be able to help our neighbors. And so I think fundamentally, I do agree with what you're saying.
You keep those overweight clothes. I got you, pal. All right, my time is up, and I will yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired and yields back, and that's the first time I've heard that analogy before. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas's 33rd District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I did want to take a little personal privilege here to talk about my friend Sylvester Turner that we lost. When I was in the state legislature with Sylvester, this was his wheelhouse. He loved talking about ERCOT and knew it in and out, and the transmission piece. And from someone that he would always proudly say that he would never say he was from Houston, he'd always say he was from Acresholm, which is a neighborhood in Houston. And from Acresholm to Harvard, Sylvester got his lesson and literally learned this particular thing that we're talking about today in and out. And I'm devastated. And I thank y'all for being here today. One of the problems that we're obviously having is that bringing new resources onto the grid. It's a challenge for a lot of different reasons. But we know that we're going to continue to have electricity demand. There was just a great article recently in one of our local papers in North Texas talking about some nuclear reactors that were going into the Haskell area of West Texas in order to help with data centers and all of the new electricity and all the new demand that's going to be online for ERCOT. One of the things that worries me is that I know that FERC's Order 2023 to modernize interconnection process has made some progress, but that there are still some barriers that remain. The connect and manage model that's used in my home state of Texas allows generators to connect faster by managing grid constraints in real time instead of waiting for upgrades. And that means that sometimes the generators will have to curtail their production, but that's a market decision that they make. And it works so well that ERCOT interconnected 2.5 times more capacity than PJM, despite PJM serving a much larger load. And so knowing all of that and knowing that America is going to have energy needs to be met and that we need a more efficient interconnection system, I wanted to ask Mr. Norris, a lot of your highlights that ERCOT is far more efficient than other regions in interconnection. And I wanted to ask you what policies allow ERCOT to interconnect projects faster than other RTOs and ISOs, and do you think they can be applied nationally?
Thank you, Congressman, for the great comments and the very good question. I think this is a very, very significant phenomenon that's happened in ERCOT over the past few years. I don't know that we've ever seen such a differential between one market exceeding every other market so substantially in such a critical area, in this case, in new capacity additions. ERCOT has taken a forward-looking approach here. So they allow generators to connect freely, and they don't charge them for the cost of network upgrades. They plan their grid separately via a separate process that's designed to identify the upgrades that have the best benefits for the ratepayers. And then they manage the impacts, as you said, in real time. So they have sophisticated real-time operational tools that allow them to manage all these new generators that are coming online. In the rest of the country, we've actually established very high barriers to entry for new generation. And the way we study them is highly restrictive, and it's likely, in many cases, to trigger substantial network upgrades. And that's really, in some ways, the primary cause of all these interconnection queue backlogs, is that we've taken this highly restrictive approach to getting new generation on the system. So I do think there are lessons that other jurisdictions can learn from ERCOT. They can't necessarily adopt it immediately because that would require larger structural reform, but there are ways that they can offer services to generators to allow them to move forward more quickly.
I know that in a lot of your work, you also suggest that better aligning interconnection, transmission, planning, and resource procurement should take place. And I was wondering, how should FERC and Congress incentivize more proactive transition investment?
Proactive transmission planning is going to be critical, and in part because we're in a very supply chain constrained environment, right? Rates are already rising, and so there's just a threshold for how much we can do very quickly. So we need proactive planning so that we can identify the highest value upgrades to the system and focus our limited resources on those. And that's exactly what Order 1920 tried to do, right, is to create this multi-value proactive approach to transmission planning. And so, I mentioned one example in the Carolinas that we did with Duke Energy, and everyone got behind that. It was highly bipartisan. It's going to unlock a lot of cheap generation that's going to contribute to reliability. But we have to make sure that we maintain Order 1920 if we want to reap the benefits of that type of proactive approach going forward.
Thank you very much. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa's 1st District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you to Chairman Latta and the Ranking Member Castor for holding this hearing today. I want to also thank our witnesses for testifying before the subcommittee. Mr. Norris, I want to especially thank you for acknowledging that the perverse incentives of the Biden administration the past 4 years actually dampened the energy generation from carbon-based fuels. But I digress. The United States is experiencing unprecedented energy demand growth, requiring us to rapidly deploy new generation capacity across the country. In Iowa, we're seeing this firsthand with the recent announcement of QTS's new data center campus in Cedar Rapids, the largest economic development investment in the city's history at a minimum of $750 million. This facility chose Cedar Rapids in part because of access to reliable, affordable, renewable energy sources, demonstrating how energy infrastructure directly impacts our ability to attract cutting-edge industries. As these technology-intensive facilities continue to expand across America, we face several critical challenges in meeting skyrocketing demand. Meanwhile, EPA's Power Plant 2.0 rule threatens to undermine grid reliability by forcing plants to implement carbon capture technology that isn't yet commercially viable at scale. We need common sense, pragmatic approaches that facilitate faster development, such as repurposing existing generation sites and unused transmission capacity to streamline permitting and accelerate clean energy integration. With that context, I'd like to ask a few questions about how we can best meet this growing demand while maintaining reliability and affordability for all consumers and not ceding national security interests to the Chinese Communist Party. Mr. Brickhouse, you mentioned that technology-based loads like data centers can become operational in 3 years, while dispatchable generation takes 7 years to build. How is Basin Electric leveraging existing sites and transmission corridors, along with considering wind, solar, and energy storage, which can be placed into service sooner to meet this interim reliability gap?
Well, with respect to renewables, when renewables are used to hit or to satisfy our peak demand, we typically think of it as needing to have backup dispatchable generation in order to satisfy the times when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining. For example, on February 20th, it was negative 30-some degrees in North Dakota and across the Great Plains and probably down into Iowa. And SPP had a peak of 48,000 megawatts, and the wind contribution to generation was about 2,000 megawatts, and that had, I believe, decreased sevenfold in 24 hours. So we need to have dispatchable generation given the harsh climates in our service territory.
Yeah, exactly, and we've seen the same thing in Iowa as well as when I visited MISO. And we know that the U.S. needs to significantly accelerate domestic energy production infrastructure, both to meet growing demand and, as I said, to compete with the Chinese Communist Party in strategic sectors like AI and clean energy. Mr. Black, your experience with developing transmission projects across multiple jurisdictions gives you unique insight into supply chain challenges. How critical are tax incentives like the tech-neutral electricity credits under 45Y and 45E and 45X advanced manufacturing for onshoring American manufacturing in the energy sector, and what would be the competitive implications be against China if these credits were significantly reduced?
Yeah, there's definitely a significant amount of investment required, and those investments or those tools that you just discussed are incredibly helpful in ensuring that we can get those projects built and online in a manner that's affordable for our customers.
Thank you. Mr. Haque, Basin Electric is experiencing load growth significantly higher than the national average, in part due to data center demand. Given your experience at PJM, what best practices would you highlight to balance increased cost to ratepayers and economic development?
So as supply decreases and demand increases, it will raise prices. And this is just the reality of the marketplace. Now, one thing that we can do is work with our retail regulators on how those costs end up getting passed down to consumers. I was a former retail regulator myself from the state of Ohio. You know, how those, we call them default service procurement auctions work, how in a deregulated state, how those costs are passed down is something that's worth examining, frankly, in all of our jurisdictions, because a price increase in just one of our markets should not actually result in a direct proportionality of costs that are passed down to consumers.
Thank you. We need to significantly accelerate domestic energy infrastructure to meet growing demand. Tax incentives like the tech-neutral clean energy credits under 45Y, 45E, and the 45Q carbon sequestration credit, and the 45X advanced manufacturing credit aim to strengthen American manufacturing capability and reduce the engineering, procurement, and construction risks that have plagued major energy projects. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Washington's 8th District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Chairman Latta, and thank you to our witnesses today. I'm going to start with just a few questions for Mr. Brickhouse. Mr. Brickhouse, Basin Electric purchases electricity from hydropower assets at the Western Area Power Administration, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. And for those who don't know, this is one of just 5 federal agencies that market electricity from federally owned hydropower. Can you talk about just how valuable the Western Area Power Administration's hydropower is to your co-op's energy mix?
Yes. So the Western Area Power Administration owns and operates about 17,000 miles of transmission through the Great Plains and down into the desert southwest. And then Bonneville Power Administration, which we don't have adjacent service territory. They have about 15,000 miles of transmission, if memory serves me correctly. And with respect to WAPA specifically, their transmission lines will end at one of their substations. On the other end of that substation, Basin's transmission line will connect and take it to the rest of our members. So
Got it.
a key partner.
So you're focusing more on transmission. I was really focusing on hydropower, which is, of course, important because it's base load and it's dispatchable, it's clean,
And we
and it's
transact with
affordable.
hydropower with them on a daily basis.
What would happen if this hydropower were to suddenly become unavailable?
My colleague from PJM says when you have a supply and demand imbalance on the demand side or the supply side shrinking, you're going to have higher prices immediately.
Higher prices, less reliability. Thank you. And in this context, the Bonneville Power Administration is similarly public power that supplies Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Idaho, and is funded by our electric bills, not by the federal government. So I want to extrapolate what this means for my state of Washington. It has twice the generating capacity of WAPA. And in fact, Bonneville is the largest of the 5 power marketing administrations. So I want to also mention that this is important to several of the Republican colleagues in this committee. Across the Pacific Northwest, Bonneville accounts for about 65% of the generating capacity in the region and most of the high voltage transmission, as you discussed. The operations, therefore, at Bonneville are essential to maintaining the grid at existing energy rates. And again, you pointed out that we, the ratepayers, pay for the operations, not the federal government. So despite all of that, the administration and Elon Musk have still set their sights and succeeded in cutting nearly 20% of the workforce there. And that includes the linemen who work on down power lines, the system operators that make sure that demand meets supply, and they are 24/7. And then, of course, the vice president of transmission. I just want to point out that these deliberate words of probationary employees is really pretty disparaging. It implies that they're in trouble and are dispensable. Really, that is not the case. It just means they've been there for less than 1 or 2 years or just got promoted. So I'm not saying BPA is perfect, but this decision is not saving taxpayer money. It's not just reckless, and it's also not helping to pay for the gigantic tax cuts that my colleagues are planning for the wealthiest people and corporations in the U.S. If this weren't even enough, the self-inflicted damage from trade wars with our allies, with Canada, just started yesterday. And the ratepayers, again, are going to be unprotected from rate hikes. So in this case, the majority in the administration may not know that the largest share of Washington State's natural gas actually comes from Canada. So this administration, the same one that promised to slash energy bills in half in the next year, is doing exactly the opposite. And over, either a basic misunderstanding of the facts, or lying to the public, or retaliation against the Northwest region, which includes Idaho and Montana, is hurting my constituents. And I sure hope that Secretary Wright is listening. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina's 7th District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today and your testimony. I come from a great state of the great state of South Carolina, where we've seen record investments from an economic development standpoint, advanced manufacturing, AI, and of course, a rapidly increasing population. Myrtle Beach, one of the towns that I represent, is the fastest growing city in the country, creating more of a demand on our grid. Companies like DC Blocks are investing in our critical infrastructure, including the Myrtle Beach Cable Landing Station, data centers across the state, expanding connectivity and supporting high-performance computing. And as these industries grow and as people continue to move to South Carolina, energy must keep up. Nuclear is key, in my mind, to meeting some of that demand. In fact, South Carolina already generates 55% of its electricity from nuclear, thanks to initiatives like the Palmetto Nuclear Coalition. We have a strong industry-led effort to advance large-scale reactors and small modular technologies. But we can't rely on the status quo for long. We have to meet that challenge in Congress. We need policies that prioritize energy expansion, modernize transmission, and regulatory certainty to ensure that American industry has the power it needs when it needs it. So I look forward to talking with y'all today. Mr. Norris, you discussed using demand response and load management programs to incorporate massive new loads onto the grid. You also mentioned how this creates headroom for more expansion in the short term. But I'm curious, how do utilities and grid operators approach the demand side response, which, if I understand correctly, expands existing energy conservation measures?
Yeah, so what we're talking about is a little different from existing demand response programs, because what we're trying to do is, in this planning realm, right, we're all trying to plan for this large load that's coming. We want to connect the dots between the large customer and the electric utility and say, we recognize, say, this data center, you're going to have some on-site power. It could be natural gas, by the way. You're going to have on-site natural gas power plants already, so let's not have redundant capacity so that we're going to have to install a new gas power plant and all the transmission to deliver the power. And in response, that data center could get online even more quickly, right, so we can compete in the AI race.
Okay.
So I think that's what we're trying to create here.
Mr. Black, I saw you writing down some stuff. Care to respond to that same question?
Yes, so to do what he was just reflecting on, we need what we call the abilities, the visibility, the dispatchability, the predictability of these loads. If we don't have that kind of control, we can't, frankly, pay that customer an appropriate amount so that they provide benefits to our system. And Southern has a long history of doing this, from RTP, real-time pricing, to interruptible standby generation rates. We've been doing this a long time, and it is an important part of, in sort of rate world, we trim the peaks and fill the valleys, and that improves the efficiency of our system. So absolutely necessary, but those abilities are probably the key to unlocking that value.
Mr. Brickhouse, same question to you. And by the way, big fan of co-ops. South Carolina co-ops are some of the best. We love them, but same question to you.
Thank you. Live in Congresswoman Fedorchuk's district, but I was born in the great state of South Carolina, so thank you.
Go Gamecocks.
I guess from our perspective as a load-serving entity, we have to look at it with some skepticism and say, what happens if the load does not respond? And that can happen. And we are in a regional transmission organization, and we are obligated to abide by their rules. I'll let Mr. Haque talk about this a little more specifically if he'd like, but a number of years ago, PJM adjusted their demand response rates because they had, and I don't want to mischaracterize this, but they had significant demand for those demand response rates, and they changed the rules and gave it less capacity accreditation. So as a utility that not subject to PJM's RTO rules, but to SPP's RTO rules, you do have to have that in the back of your mind. Is the load going to show up when you curtail that demand? And is the regional transmission organization going to change the rules down the road, and we're suddenly going to have to come up with more capacity?
Thank you for that. Mr. Brickhouse, as a utility operator, what are the benefits of policies that promote energy abundance rather than scarcity management?
Permitting reform is a concern, and I think that there are a number of changes that Congress can make to the National Environmental Policy Act that would be very helpful to have additional resources come online more quickly.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I see the balance of my time is just now expired, and with that, I yield back.
Gentlemen, time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida's 15th district for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to all of our witnesses here today. Ensuring the reliability and affordability of our electric power system is crucial for our national security, our economy, and the well-being of our communities. My home state of Florida is one of the nation's largest producers of electricity, with rapid population growth, increased manufacturing, and advances in technology, including artificial intelligence and the data centers needed to power it. Our demand and production will only continue to rise. It's imperative that our electric grid is prepared to meet this growing demand for power. Our generation and transmission systems must be reliable and resilient, with the ability to ensure continuous power supply and to respond quickly to unforeseen circumstances and changes in demand. Mr. Brickhouse, in your testimony, you mentioned the rapidly evolving threat landscape and that the electric sector faces considerable challenges from our cyber adversaries. Would you expand, please, on the types of cyber threats that our electric power system faces?
Well, it's not terribly different than what you and I face every day when we go home. If you click on a wrong link and your computer is, you get some type of virus in it that can spread rapidly and shut your computer down. And obviously, in the utility space or at any business, we have large networks that can be shut down and harmed relatively quickly by those.
You also mentioned several specific programs that Basin Electric has leveraged to strengthen its cybersecurity posture, including the Threat Analysis Center, Rural Municipality Utility Cybersecurity Program. Are there any specific programs or best practices related to cyber that you want to highlight or share as success stories?
Right. Well, I'll answer it a little bit differently, is that we appreciate the federal government's support here because these are national security issues, and many of the bad actors are people from overseas. And so we need to work in a coordinated fashion with intelligence agencies in order to make sure that we understand the threats and can defend ourselves and our networks from those threats.
And Mr. Black, in your testimony, you mentioned that energy policy is highly regional due to some variations in factors like weather, geography, and resources. And Florida, like several of the other southern states that your company serves, experienced devastating hurricanes last year. I am interested in discussing further with you how utility companies like yours prepare for these types of events.
We are certainly practiced, unfortunately, at dealing with hurricanes. We had one of the largest hurricanes in our company's history this last year as it moved through Georgia. More poles, but I can go through all the statistics. It's devastating. Our ability to work with our friends in a coordinated manner to get customers back on is probably better than it's ever been, right? I think the investment in our system from a resilience perspective and the investment in our system in recovery has been, it improves year to year. These events get more remarkable, it seems, as the South continues to grow and proliferate, but our ability to invest in the system for resilience so that we can get back on quicker and work with our peers and colleagues around the country to bring those resources in is better than it's been ever.
And you just touched on something that I want to ask a follow-up question about, and that is, I understand the investor-owned utilities mutual assistance program has been beneficial for getting customers' lights back on in the wake of these extreme weather events. Can you share with us what that program is and how it has helped you work on disaster recovery?
Certainly, it's the processes and communication and the network that is required to call in crews from all over the country. And again, these last few storms, we had trucks and folks as far away from the West Coast coming into Georgia and North Carolina and so many of these states that were devastated. So the Mutual Assistance Program, again, at this point is so well practiced, and the ability of companies to get people quickly on the work is the challenge. Having just the resources is step one. Getting them on the work is where the practice and the training and the commitment comes from.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back the balance of time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York's 23rd District for 5 minutes for questions.
Brickhouse. In its 2024 long-term reliability assessment issued last month, NERC ranked the middle part of the country in the MISO area as high risk for energy shortfalls with elevated risk throughout many other regions. And NERC notes that Section 111 standards, MATS rule, coal ash regulations and effluent limitations guidelines specifically are, quote, regulations that impose considerable financial and operational challenges on coal-fired generators, and, quote, have the potential to influence generators to seek deactivation during the 10-year assessment period of NERC's study. For the first time in years, we're facing increasing demand for electricity, in part due to ballooning demand from data centers and increased electrification. But the previous administration under President Biden tried to engineer an accelerated shift in the mix of electricity generation in the country with the goal of trying to force the shutdown of coal-fired power plants while discouraging natural gas transmission and generation. Mr. Brickhouse, should we have requirements that any environmental push to shift the mix of electricity production be fully vetted by reliability authorities like FERC and NERC, or should we have reliability at the center of electricity planning moving forward?
I think that in terms of regulations, we have to be careful of unintended consequences, and regulations that are put in by well-intentioned people today have the threat of being misused in the future. As a utility, and I think Mr. Black referenced this earlier as well, it is our obligation to balance supply and demand.
Thank you. In the last 4 years, and looking even earlier than that, Democratic administrations have put their own public policy agenda items ahead of real issues like reliability and affordability. We saw this play out with former President Biden's work to shut down generation. And we see it on a state level with states like my home state of New York, where radical, even irresponsible public policies like the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act are putting zealous goals for emissions reductions and electrification ahead of basic questions about reliability, affordability, and the safety of residents. So I'd like to go down the row here and ask, have you seen state policies lead to or have an effect on higher rates and lower reliability? Mr. Brickhouse?
Yes.
Mr. Haque?
Absolutely.
Mr. Norris? Mr. Black?
I will say our region, in its support of our states and that regulation close to the states, has resulted in affordable and reliable power for our companies, so and our customers. So I would say state alignment around that issue, at least in our region, and this is back to that regionalism, has been strong.
Now, the New York grid plans to add 3.5 gigawatts of new large loads to its system by 2030, including Micron's microchip fabrication facilities in the Syracuse area, which are creating thousands of new jobs and leading to billions in dollars of new investment. Now, currently, my state relies on energy supplies from other states in Canada to meet more than 80% of its total energy needs and has the country's 7th highest average residential electricity rates. Now, meanwhile, vast natural gas, hydropower, and geothermal resources in New York remain untapped. I find this to be unacceptable. Unlocking our abundant energy resources can lower the cost of electricity while adding new loads to the system can put downward pressure on consumer rates. Mr. Black, we've heard today about the demand needs of various technologies like AI computing, cryptocurrency mining, and expanded manufacturing, such as the Micron facility that I mentioned. What policy considerations should be made to ensure grid reliability and efficiency while accommodating very energy-intensive industries coming into new areas? I'm sorry, Mr. Pipe.
So I think two important points there. Firm gas pipes, and we've talked a little bit about today this interconnection, sort of accountability and affected systems. Those are processes at our state level that we see that result in a more ubiquitous transmission and gas system. You don't build a gas pipeline without a firm gas contract. And that could be some of the struggles. I'm not as familiar with your region, I'm sorry for that, but our area is committed to that, and again, those firm gas contracts are resulting in more infrastructure to support the region.
Thank you. These policies and their consequences are being felt across the country and will be felt in the coming years. They clearly warrant greater scrutiny, even vetting. As a New Yorker whose constituents experience the results of such irresponsible policies as they relate to our electricity needs firsthand, I believe strongly that we need to ensure reliability and affordability are always at the forefront of energy policy moving forward in all levels of policymaking. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado's 8th District, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you, of course, to the witnesses for coming today. In Colorado's 8th Congressional District, I represent a working-class district, northern suburbs of Denver, for whom energy is a major, major driver in the economy. In fact, the local electric utility that provides power to our area also services one of the major oil and gas fields in the area. And in my conversations with them, they have said that they are forecasting needing 3 times as much electricity in the next 10 years as they're currently using now, and that's after doubling the amount of electricity that they have to provide over the last 10 years. And so, Mr. Brickhouse, the first question to you is, I've also heard directly from these utilities that because of Colorado's just very draconian laws around greenhouse gases emissions and the so-called carbon-free roadmap in Colorado, they're being forced to pull gigawatts of coal-fired generation off of the grid in Colorado. And so the question to you is, when you or your members are faced with those draconian regulations that require gigawatts of electrical generation to be pulled off of the grid, how does that impact your ability and the ability of other electrical providers to be able to keep up with the growing demand for electricity and keep it affordable?
We had a very short period of time in the late teens where our growth was slowing, and it quickly reaccelerated after COVID, and we've grown basically 5 to 7% in unit sales every year after that. And that dramatically changed our expected path of our resources. We had tentative plans to evaluate closure of some facilities, and those are gone today, and I concur with the distribution cooperative you've been talking to down there. The demand growth that we have in the future is going to require every existing resource, and it's going to require utilities to build enormous amounts of dispatchable generation in the future.
How would you characterize the decision to retire coal-fired generation in the United States and in Colorado?
We have a member in Colorado that serves that load, so they have dealt with it one way. In North Dakota and other parts of our service territory, Wyoming, close proximity to Colorado, we are keeping our all-of-the-above resource strategy intact.
Do you think it's wise to be retiring coal-fired generation when we need additional capacity, not less?
No.
Thank you. Moving on to NEPA reform. We know how critical it is that we not be our own worst enemy when we're trying to expand electrical generation so that folks have access to affordable and reliable electricity. And we've often heard conversations about how NEPA can sometimes get in the way of that. So do you have any examples that you might be willing to elaborate on about how Congress can streamline the permitting of getting more electrical generation onto the grid?
I think with NEPA, the best example is there's a project that we were doing with 2 partners. It was a natural gas development, and we got caught up in an extra review. And it, as a result of that, will likely write off a significant portion, if not all, of the development costs of that project.
Thank you. Switching to Mr. Haque. I represent truly an all-of-the-above energy district. We have a major oil and gas footprint, but we also have wind, we have solar, we have geothermal. We used to have nuclear generation. We don't have that anymore in Colorado. We're trying to get that back. And so my question to you is, as we are looking at, again, in my area, needing 3 times as much electricity in the next 10 years, are there any emerging technologies, SMRs, geothermal, that you would like to see us be able to move forward to help meet some of this demand, and then also be able to co-locate the generation with the demand, knowing that we have certain shortcomings in the transmission?
Yeah, Representative, great question. In the near term, here's what we're going to see. We're going to see quite a few of the renewables, hopefully, that are in our queue connect to the system. We're going to see uprates of existing generating units. I think I described some of the nuclear uprates. There's the possibility of gas uprates as well. And I think you're going to see more demand response participate in our marketplace long term. We are going to get more renewables into the system. We're going to need new natural gas, and we're going to need new technologies. SMRs are a very promising technology, but they are some years away. So we are dealing with the technology that exists today, and that technology is, as we sit here today, again, we've got effectively our existing fleet, and then new renewables, new storage, new natural gas.
Thank you. Yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from North Dakota for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here and for sharing your expertise with us. I have a few rapid-fire questions I want to ask to start, just because I want to hear from all of you. So just a yes or no on the first one. In your opinion, can you both support renewables and support the urgent need for more dispatchable, fuel-secure resources? Mr. Brickhouse.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Secondly, is the call for more dispatchable, fuel-secure power generation driven by partisan politics or grid physics and mechanics?
Physics.
Physics.
It's a more complex answer, I think.
You only get one choice. Grid mechanics or partisan politics?
So I think there are cost considerations that come into play as well, but other than that, physics.
Okay,
Physics and finance, but physics, yes.
thank you. I'm glad you brought up finance, because I want to talk about that next. As it relates to cost, there's lots of talk about this is the lowest cost, that's the lowest cost. As it relates to cost, does the cost per kilowatt cover the full cost of any generation source? And if not, what is left out of that? And what goes into the bill that customers pay? Because I had a lot of customers tell me as a regulator, if everything is so cheap, why is my bill going up? So, Mr. Brickhouse, what else besides the cost per kilowatt do you include in your bills to customers?
We include hundreds of millions of dollars a year of costs related to environmental compliance. So that is one area. And then when we talk to our members, a good example for Basin is that our existing generation assets are on our books for $800 a kW installed. New generation of a dispatchable baseload sort would cost about $2,600 a kW installed. So there's a cost aspect to that as well.
Okay. Mr. Black, what goes into your customer bills that we haven't talked
So
about?
certainly the wires costs, transmission distribution, the variable O&M and the capital required to run our plants and keep them up to compliance, and all, EPA requirements along those lines. It's the capital and the variable aspects of fuel and such. So it's a lot of components. And I would say it differs a little bit too in the structure that you have. Obviously, our vertically integrated structure, we build and then they pay, a share of the capital cost in our bills as opposed to sort of the market component maybe a PJM has that's broken out. It's a little more complex, I think.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Haque, the one most disappointing thing for me in this new role is that partisan politics gets way too involved in the management of the grid, in my opinion. If, as you're the smart person, you're the one ultimately keeping the grid running in the PJM area, MISO does it, SPP does it, what
Do you wish that federal and state policymakers understood or knew more about before they made policies affecting energy?
You know, all policy choices that exacerbate our supply-demand challenges will have direct consumer impact. They will have impact on reliability degradation. They will have impact on cost. And then I'd say the other thing is that, again, I think we are all collectively trying to find this balance of, our North Star is reliability, but we are very conscious of cost. And, I've got 2 little boys at home. I mean, I want them to breathe cleaner air as well. And so we're trying to find this sort of balance and sweet spot between all 3 of these. But in order to find that balance and sweet spot, we also have to understand the physics of these resources and what they can provide to the grid. That is also essential.
Okay. Mr. Brickhouse, and I have 1 minute left, so I have 2 more questions. You're seeing significant demand increase. Do you expect that you can meet that demand with renewables alone?
No.
How about you, Mr. Black?
No, not renewables alone.
Asim, do you think that we can meet the demand for what we're seeing in terms of AI, manufacturing,
Not based on our forecast,
electrification?
no.
All right. Sir, I forgot your name because I don't have it in front of me. Mr. Norris, do you think we can meet the demand with renewables alone?
No, but that also includes storage and nuclear and thermal resources, so yes.
With all of those, you think we can?
And demand response and energy efficiency too, yes.
Okay. Well, I've only got 10 seconds, so I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes for questions.
First, I want to thank Chairman Latta for allowing me to wave on to this important hearing. When it comes to energy generation, I believe in all of the above, but all of the above, I believe that we can all agree we need to utilize accessible, affordable energy. And that is the coal and the natural gas that is under the feet of my constituents. All generation is not created equal. The capacity factors of wind and solar are simply too small to provide the reliable energy that our grid requires. What we need, in simple terms, is more baseload generation. We need more coal, more gas, and more nuclear. It doesn't matter how many gigawatts of wind and solar capacity that are built if they are not generating them when you need them. Unfortunately, we are doing worse than not building dispatchable generation. We're actually retiring it. We're shutting it down. PJM, which is the nation's largest RTO and includes my district in Pennsylvania, released a report in 2023 projecting 40 gigawatts of reliable, dispatchable generation will retire by 2030. PJM labels the majority of these retirements as, quote, policy-driven decisions. This is at a time when demand is growing. Tech leaders like Elon Musk have said AI could lead energy demand to be as much as twice as what it currently is today. Pennsylvania is in a great position to benefit from the investment in the jobs of the AI revolution. We have already begun to see this benefit with agreements between AWS and Talon Energy at the Susquehanna Nuclear Generation Facility and the reopening of 3 Mile Island, thanks to the power purchase agreement between Constellation Energy and Microsoft. Mr. Haque, successfully deploying and powering new AI data centers at the speed demanded to compete on the global stage will be heavily dependent on the actions taken by FERC to address co-location. How is PJM approaching the issue of co-location, both in its work with FERC and on its own?
Thank you, Representative. It is still an evolving story. And the FERC recently actually had, they issued an order that requires us and the transmission owners to come to them with a potential solution. We are in the throes of working with our membership and our states to try and figure out what that solution should look like. I would have more information for you in 30, 60 days, but we are working that solution right now with, again, our states and members.
Mr. Haque, I hope that you will agree with me that we need more generation built within PJM. And what are the tools in PJM's toolbox to encourage the investment and the building of new generation?
The tools in the toolbox, depending on whether you are a restructured or deregulated state or a vertically integrated state, Pennsylvania is a restructured or deregulated state, who are reliant on markets to try and incentivize new investment. Now, we have a capacity market that is meant to be a residual market. So parties like the one you're referencing, you actually referenced TMI and Microsoft, they can enter into bilateral transactions in order to make sure that they have, Microsoft in this instance, has the power that they need, and the capacity market can be relied upon to send what I would say are directional price signals, as well as to incentivize new investment.
So, Mr. Haque, are capacity auctions one of the tools in your toolbox? And do you believe that capacity auctions are working to incentivize building new generation? And if not, what can be used to attract that new generation, that new investment?
Yeah, so for Representative, for our deregulated states, the capacity market is the primary tool that is utilized to try and incentivize new investment to the marketplace. However, I continue to think that as we see this proliferation in demand driven by data centers, driven by the onshoring of U.S. manufacturing, I think you will see more, again, bilateral transactions that occur within the footprint. And look, the other thing I would say is there are tools that can be utilized that have not been utilized yet. For instance, we've got the potential, if we clear 3 years below our reserve margin, that we can utilize a competitive procurement mechanism. That is a tool that is currently in our toolbox that we can utilize. States have taken action as well, depending on the resource types that they prefer, in order to try and advance new generation. And those actions can find their way into our marketplace as well. So,
As we see the expansion of AI, we are going to rely more on you expanding those tools in your toolbox. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing me to wave on, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia's 1st District for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to wave on to this committee, and thank all of you for being here. I suspect I'm the last one to ask questions, so you're almost done. Business is booming. We need more electricity. We're counting on y'all. I don't want you to feel any pressure, but we are counting on you, okay? We need you. My own state of Georgia, 11 years in a row, #1 state to do business in. Very proud of that, and there's a reason for that. Because we've created a pro-business environment, our legislature, our governors, they've created a pro-business environment, and we have available energy. We have affordable, reliable energy. That's another reason why people and businesses want to locate to Georgia. I know firsthand that the demand for more electricity is one of the top challenges that we face right now, and we'll continue to face that going forward. Mr. Black, in your written testimony, you also note that the state of Georgia is open for business. In fact, companies are flocking to Georgia because we have good policies, as I say, for business. Mr. Black, what's unique about Georgia? What should Congress do to make sure that the Georgia can remain open for business?
Yes, so the load coming to Georgia is remarkable. I mean, we have line of sight on 10,000 megawatts. I know we've said a lot of numbers today, but that's a lot of electricity. And in the queue, another 50,000 of proposed and projects that may come our way. I believe some of the structures, the electricity structure that we have is incredibly important. It will result in firm gas pipelines. It will result in firm electric transmission. But those pipelines and the need for those and some of the reforms we've talked about in and around NEPA and the Clean Water Act and some judicial reform to get the pipelines done in time is essential.
Okay.
That's a national issue.
Well, let me ask you something, and if I get any of this wrong, you're the expert, so please correct me, okay? But I think it's important to note that the state of Georgia is the only state that has built nuclear reactors in the last 30 years. We have 2 new nuclear reactors at Plant Vogtle, and I believe that Plant Vogtle right now, with the 4 nuclear reactors that are there, is providing about 22% of the electricity needs in the state. And if you combine that with Plant Hatch, which is in my district, in the 1st district, they're providing about 8%. Therefore, about 30% of the energy in the state of Georgia is coming from nuclear.
That sounds accurate, yes.
Yeah. So let me ask you something, because I heard SMRs. A lot of people have been talking about SMRs, but we don't have any under construction right now, do we? Does anybody on the panel know of any that we have under construction?
Not domestically that I'm aware of, no.
Okay.
AP 1000s, as you know.
Well, the reason I ask this is because, and I'm, hang with me here if you will. If Georgia Power were to build more nuclear, would it be SMRs, or would you continue with the reactors like you have at Plant Vogtle? Because it's my understanding that you would rather do that than to do the SMRs.
Well, we learned a lot, and we have, I think, understand the risks and the time. I mean, the improvement from 3 to 4 was about 20%.
That's what I understand.
Remarkable. So, you know, if you could go 5, 6, 7, you know, either in our state or some other states within the country, the AP 1000, I think the risk, the cone of risk, if you will, is much smaller than some technology we haven't quite developed fully.
Well, I would submit to you that Georgia following through on that project, even though it was challenging, no question about that, but I would submit to you that following through on that project gave the blueprint, if you will, for nuclear reactors in the United States, because as you say, we had a 20% saving between number 3 and 4, and learned a lot of important lessons that can be shared.
Yeah, absolutely. Hard, but worth it. And again, the fact that it is on all the time is such a remarkably important element.
And it's the largest provider of clean energy in the United States. Is that correct?
That's correct. Number 1.
Number 1.
Yes.
Plus, Georgia's the number 7 state in the country for solar.
Why are we the number 7 state?
Georgia is the number 7 state, is that correct?
That is. It is in the top 10. There are a number of
Yeah.
states in the southeast that have solar resources. I think we're finding, I think it's important to be resource agnostic, but resource aware, and we're able to find ways to get solar on because it is an asset and a resource within our state we can bring on the system affordably.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to come in here and brag about my home state of Georgia, as I have done for the last 5 minutes. So thank y'all very much for being here.
But the gentleman from Georgia, Texas is number 1, just so you know.
Let's not get into that. Okay. The gentleman's time has expired and yields back, and seeing no other members wishing to ask questions of our witnesses today, I remind members that if they do have additional written questions that they might be submitting to you, that we'd ask that you get those back to us within 10 business days. And I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned. And again, thank you to our witnesses for appearing today.